Sawdust Footprints, a novel by Joseph M. Mascia. For my father. Chapter 1. A long day. Inside the cold trailer, a heavy layer of frost coated the ceiling and windows. In the back, the men were still asleep, frozen breath escaping from their sleeping bags, heads buried deep within. All asleep except for one man. He lay staring up at the sooty, frosty ceiling in the dim light, watching his breath. The mist curled chaotically and spread out as it reached the ceiling. In his dream, he had been falling endlessly with nothing to grab hold of. That woke him. It always did. He listened to the sounds around him, snores mostly, and groans and coughs. The beep of the cook's watch alarm had gone off minutes ago, and now soft, even snores came forth again from the bottom front bunk across the aisle. From the top front bunk came snores and groans intermingled, like lamentations, as though the sleeper was experiencing new pains and injustices with each icy breath. From the top bunk directly across the aisle came melodic snores, almost musical, interrupted now and then by a merry little chuckle or a garbled sentence fragment. From the bunk below that, coughs and coughs, painful-sounding deep ones or little coughs that trailed off, then a stretch of silence followed by more of the deeper type. From the bunk directly below him, brutish snorts and gasps, like some great beast drowning slowly, interminably. He wasn't listening to this chorus too closely, neither was he tuning it out. He extended his arms out of the sleeping bag and upward, waiting his feeling return to his hands, touching the wooden feeling, tingling fingertips together until normal feeling returned. Precious, relaxed minutes. The day ahead would be long, longer than usual. It was still dark out. Nothing to do right now, for a few minutes at least. Nothing worth thinking about. Precious minutes. From a collection of pebbles on the windowsill next to his bunk, he selected one, leaned out over the aisle and took aim at the crown of the cook's head, a small oval of disheveled curls just barely visible, poking out of the opening in the sleeping bag, cocked his arm back and let fly. A hit. Soon the cook looked confusedly around him, then at his watch, threw back his covers and hurriedly dressed. Their eyes met for a second, and the cook stood, put his face close, spoke in a low voice, quieter than a whisper. "No heat." He nodded sympathetically. "Who was supposed to change the tanks?" "Fred, I think. Does it matter?" The cook hissed a disgusted exhalation and turned up the aisle, grabbing a couple of tools from the cabinet before walking out. Now he listened carefully to the noises just outside, the crunchy footsteps around to the tanks behind the trailer, a couple of bangs of the wrench on the empty tank, one on the full, the wrench fumbling on the fitting, some squeaks and bangs as the wrench grabs and the nut turns, then the line being moved over to line up with the fitting on the full tank, some more fumbling with the wrench and squeaking as the nut is tightened. The valve squeaking open, the quick hiss of gas in the line. Good boy. Not hopeless after all. He jumped down and threw on his pants and shirt, then knelt to relight the gas heater. At first there was just the hiss of the gas, and then the flame shot across the row of jets with a whoosh. Good deed done. The cook came back inside, pausing near the front to light the stove burners. Soon heat was pouring into the room, and before long the rest of the sleepers were stirring. He slipped on his boots and grabbed his coat. "Not staying for my fine breakfast this morning, Lester?" "Ha! Gotta get the jump." He reached into the refrigerator and brought out his own things. A small pail of cottage cheese, a jug of orange juice, a bottle of cod liver oil, and a bottle of vitamin tablets. He took a swig of the cod liver oil, chased it with a few spoonfuls of the cottage cheese, took a vitamin tablet, and washed it down with juice, then replaced all the containers on the bottom shelf. Ah, that's right. Today's the day. Big day. Our hero. And don't forget it. Later on, pup. Les pushed open the door and jumped down to the frozen, uneven sod. The thermometer on the trailer read 8 degrees. Good. Cold, but not real cold. No wind. Light was coming into the eastern sky, pushing back the purple fringe of the night. A light was on in the pickers' quarters, where the rest of the crew was housed, and a big, unkempt head showed through the picture window. They would be coming over to the trailer soon. It was still very quiet outside. His crunchy footsteps only emphasized the quiet. There was only an occasional car down on the road. One light was on in the farmhouse. Probably a nightlight. He grabbed his equipment out of the back of the van. Handsaw, belt, chainsaw, can of gas. Oil was up in the orchard. His pruning pole was hanging in yesterday's last tree. He followed the trail of ice from the trailer sink drain out their drive, a tractor road, around the storage barn, and out into the parking lot. The ice trail petered out in some tall weeds, and he crossed the parking lot, past the greenhouses on his right, and went up another tractor road into the main hill block where they were all now working. Some flinty sparrows were chattering in the brambly ditch behind the greenhouses. Here and there the ground was bare, but most of the surface had a crusty layer of leftover snow, up to a foot deep in places where it had drifted. He passed the completed rows with the many tangled limbs every which way in the spray rows, looking up occasionally to examine his own or someone else's work from a few days back. Near the top of the hill, he reached his new row. He turned to his right, to the north, and went roughly 8 trees in, where he had left a jug of oil. He filled his saw and left the gas can beside the oil, hung his handsaw from a nearby branch in his own row, and returned to his first tree. His right hand, which had carried the gas can, had gone numb on the walk up. He blew into the glove while looking up into the tree. The sun wasn't up, but there was enough light to work. Les was in a race today, set up by a couple of the other crew members. He was pitted against a man who was not on the crew, and worked alone, using a nifty-looking contraption, a combination large, all-terrain vehicle with a positionable bucket for the man, and small chainsaw on an extension pole that apparently ran off a PTO arrangement. Phil, the grower, had given this other man his own block of the orchard to work, the block just to the south. Some of the crewmen couldn't resist the challenge. Les reluctantly agreed to represent them after looking at the calendar. 1 full day, he stipulated, starting first light on Tuesday. Most trees done. $50 to the winner, put up by the crew. 3 roughly equal rows had been chosen from the respective blocks, well more than anyone could do in a day. The day had arrived. Phil wasn't even aware that this contest was going on in his orchard, but he probably wouldn't mind, as long as nobody got hurt and the work got done. It was a casual kind of race, nothing to get worked up about. It wasn't a man against the machine kind of contest, since Les used a machine as well. He was more curious than anything, curious to see how many more trees than he this rig could do. Today would be a good day to push. He was ready to go. He took his glove off and choked the engine for the first pull. It fired and cut out. He opened the choke, put his glove back on, and pulled the cord again. A few low revs and the motor smoothed out. He cut off a handful of ground suckers and 1 larger vine, then shut the saw off again while he climbed up through the tree. As he neared the top scaffold limbs, he started the saw again and neatly cut off the dozens of water sprouts that emerged from the old cuts, from the healing edges of limbs long removed. Then he searched out those larger cuts he had picked out from the ground, the corrective cuts that justified his pay. He had trained dozens of men over the years, and so had tried to reduce what they did to its simplest terms, which were, as he saw them, in and thin, Every cut was either a thinning cut or an inning cut, a cut that somehow reduced the tree's size. Maybe it was a little like reducing the stock market to buy low, sell high. True enough as far as it went, but there must be more to it. He had never owned a stock or a bond, so he didn't really know. Still, it amused him somehow that what he did could be summed up in this way. There were several men on this crew that he had trained. Dave, the cook, he was coming along. Of the 3 men sleeping in the pickers' quarters, he had trained 2. The smaller cuts, the water sprouts and pieces of limbs, fell down through the tree, though many got hung up along the way. The larger cuts tumbled out and thudded to the crust-covered ground. All except one. He turned the saw off, hung it on the hook of his belt, and climbed down. In the relative cold of the early morning, his hands had become numb again. He would pole each tree as he went for a while, until he warmed up. As he reached the hooked pole up near the top to snag the large, hung-up piece, he heard the engine of the large pruning rig fire up down the hill to the south, and knew the contest had been joined. In and thin, that was it. Late November through early June, every day except Sunday, some Saturdays, and those days when there was an ice storm or heavy ice on the limbs. The rest of the year he filled in with various kinds of work, but none of them was what he was. What he was a pruner, not a tree surgeon, not an arborist specializing in productive varieties, not an orchard renovator, a pruner. Pruner. Even the word had kind of a ridiculous ring to it, made you think of dried up fruit and regular bowel movements. That was it, though. No getting around it. He knew it was a decent living if you stayed healthy. It was as worthwhile a thing to do as the next job. It had its moments. Something about the sound of it, though. Pruner. And those 2 little words that summed it up. In and thin. 14 years. Over 30 years old. What was giving him that sunk feeling this morning, though, was the same thought that had done the job for the past couple of months. He couldn't see his boys. Hadn't seen them, in fact, for more than a couple of minutes at a time since Christmas, and wasn't likely to any time soon. They were off this week, too. The incident that led to this latest separation from his family kept repeating itself in his mind, giving him a fresh jab each time. He was in the kitchen of their apartment, under the sink, trying to resolder a copper pipe, but it keeps moving on him just as he's putting the torch to it. Calmly he calls to his younger boy in the next room. If he'll just hold things in place with the pliers while Les does the soldering, the whole thing won't take a minute. No answer. The boy's nose is soldered to the TV. Twice more he calls calmly, the last time receiving a feeble, "In a minute," for a reply. Does Les then patiently wait for his boy to find the right moment to come give him a hand? Does he calmly but persistently repeat his request? Does he get furious even, scream and yell a bit, or shut the TV off and lead his son in by the hand? No, he has a better plan. He goes in and kicks in the TV screen. That was that. Nothing to it. Flying glass had come very close to cutting his son. Close enough, apparently. That night, his wife and the children are gone. A few days later, a kindly, somewhat embarrassed-looking older man comes to the door and gives him an official-looking piece of paper, and then he, Les, is gone. First setting up his tiny camper down at the boat landing north of town, and then, when the cold weather sets in for good, moving the camper to the nearby orchard of Pete DeWitt, where he can bring in an electric cord and have a heater. By then he was on the road 5 days a week with the crew anyway. Sleeping out in the camper was nothing. He could put up with that for years. Not being able to see his boys was killing him. Was he never to see them again except for a few minutes at a time? It was clearly in his wife's power. He was the one with the criminal record and the erratic work history. And now this. What judge would side with him? The few times he had spoken to his wife recently, her manner had been very cold, formal. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. His second tree was a young Macintosh. He was up and down the trunk and had pulled out the brush in a matter of minutes. The next was a huge old Baldwin with the top of its suckers reaching well over 20 feet. Though he filled the saw before starting on it, he ran out of gas while up in the top. While he was refueling, he heard the van rumble up the tractor road with the rest of the crew. Soon he saw several men carrying their equipment out to their rows as the sunlight filtered through the leafless forest trees on the low hill at the edge of the eastern horizon. He had warmed up now and didn't want to stand around, but Dave came up to fill his saw while Les was still there. First words out of Benny's mouth as he looks at his row, says to Herbie, "That guy's got 3 easy ones right off the bat. That ain't right." Talking about me. Like Herbie stuck those easy trees in the beginning of my row just to spite him. "You run for a lawyer?" Says that guy like he doesn't even know my name after, over a year on the same crew. "But he recognized you." "Yeah, from somewhere." Dave looked along Les's row and back to the tree he had half finished, then gave a low whistle. "You're the one with a case, bud. Why didn't you fill up before you started that one?" "Did." Dave shook his head in mock sympathy. They parted. Saws started up from several locations over the backdrop of the steadier drone of the motor of the pruning rig way off to the south. Les had watched that rig operate one afternoon for a little while. Nifty, the way it hugged the uneven ground and balanced itself like some kind of moon vehicle. The way the operator could maneuver the little bucket around and reach the saw up and in for cuts. He was impressed. As he thought about it, though, he realized what he didn't like about it, and more importantly, about the finished trees. They looked like they'd been done from the outside in and not from the inside out. It made a big difference. They looked like they weren't half done. That was why it wouldn't really faze him to prune fewer trees in a day, to lose the contest. That and all that horsepower, he would be lucky to lose by 10. He was just pleased to be working well. He didn't yet know how well. Just to work, to push himself very hard, to concentrate only on his work as he had in the past been able to do. That was the thing. So far, so good. To work at his peak, everything had to be going well at the same time. It was a given that his equipment was in good order. He had learned the lessons during his first 2 seasons. He could quickly fix or replace anything that might break, snap, dull, tear, or conk out. His body, too, seemed well suited to the task. 5 feet 8, 135 pounds, wiry, sinewy. He could work any length day without slowing down. In fact, he had never felt better. All that the years seemed to have done so far was to teach him how to take care of himself. Through haphazard and occasional inquiry, he had learned a little about what to eat and what not to eat. It seemed clear enough that this work would eventually start to take its toll. All he had to do was look around him at some of the guys in their late 30s and early 40s who were still at it. But wearing out so young didn't seem inevitable, any more than that a businessman should have a heart attack or a stroke in his 50s, a matter of common sense and some self-discipline. At least he hoped that was true, since he saw little hope for doing anything else at this stage of the game. He didn't like to think about doing anything else with his life. It was like looking over a cliff. As to having the right mental outlook to work well, that was clearly the tricky part. It did no good to constantly dwell on what was troubling him. Quite the contrary, it could only slow him down. But he couldn't force the situation from his mind. Not this time. It sat there like a turd in some corner of his mind, not going anywhere, polluting every thought. Usually the work itself brought on a kind of attentive thoughtfulness and reflectiveness that was probably as good for solving one's problems as paying big money to lie on an analyst's couch. He couldn't be sure of that either, never having lounged on an analyst's couch. In and thin, that was what it boiled down to, but there was definitely something worthwhile about it. He shut the saw off and jumped out of the small tree he was working, paused and listened for a moment. Whenever he slipped the little target practice hearing protectors back from his ears, all the noises around him seemed especially vivid, at least momentarily. Again he heard the saws running in several locations over the steadier drone of the larger rig. He assumed, that he was falling behind already. Gibby and Stu, who had instigated the race and were now the unofficial referees, were sure to be by to keep him informed, particularly as he fell behind. His hands had warmed up, the pain in his fingers was gone. The rest of him had never been cold. Too big, too little. A good start. He was working as well as he had all season. It might be a contest at that. The big trees, full-size standards, earned the pruners $4 each. The little trees, the interplanted semi-dwarves, paid $1.60. Strictly piecework. The crew boss, Herbie, got a cut. When a worker, thinking the system unfair, quit the crew and got a job on his own, he rarely earned more. A man on his own couldn't get the same prices. Plus, he slowed down. The competition was gone. On a crew, everybody wanted to see who'd bring home the biggest paycheck. On this crew, there was never much question. Les enjoyed taking jobs on his own and working alone, but he didn't like running crews, though he'd done it often enough. Too much like babysitting. Too much like being a social worker. Contest, of course, was the better word for what was going on today, not race, though they were all calling it a race. Race conjures up running around as fast as possible, which, in the context of this work, would be madness. True, he worked fast, and some said they thought he worked as fast as was humanly possible, but he didn't worry about that. He worked as fast as was reasonable for him, given the unavoidable level of risk. In general, though, today would be a day like any other. He would be doing what he usually did, at times maybe a little faster, with fewer breaks, maybe a longer day, but nothing else out of the ordinary, nothing stupid. No shortcuts for the work either. After all, what would be the point of being their representative if he did a lousy job? Now, in addition to his overall gloomy frame of mind, two memories floated into his mind and hung around a while. The first from a few years back, his most recent violent episode, other than the unfortunate run-in with the TV set, when he had gotten in a fight with one of the dope peddlers at the apartment houses where his family was then residing. He had ended up beating the man badly, even when he was down and beaten, something he hadn't done even in his scrappy teenage years. He had told the guy, politely he thought, to clear off, to leave his sons, and everybody else's kids for that matter, alone, and clear off. The man made the mistake of snickering while casually displaying the blade that had been up his sleeve. It was the snickering that set him off as much as the blade. Anyway, the poor guy wasn't much of a match. Maybe he had sampled too much quality product that day, who knows. Les was the one who got the conviction and jail time, his opponent's knife notwithstanding, but he had never seen that particular man around again, and that's what mattered. Not that anything had changed. His boys were still in danger. There was no shortage of losers peddling Lord knows what at the old apartments. They had since moved. Maybe the new place was a little better, but not much. He thought about this act of violence itself and couldn't condemn himself for it, though he was usually pretty hard on himself. The jail time and additional blot on his record meant nothing to him. It was the way it took several men to drag him away that was most revealing. Parental instinct right in there down deep with the hairy beast. Then a memory from his own early years, still startling perhaps, because it stood out so sharply from such an otherwise happy period. He was about 7. Every day he rode his bike to school, and every afternoon on the way home, a little dog came out to chase him from beside the garage of a pale green house on Eastman Street. A runty little thing, purebred mutt, white with black spots, big floppy ears. It would tear madly up the long driveway, yapping its little head off, going at a ferocious clip, and then chase him down the road for a good quarter mile while he pedaled as fast as he could and laughed like a madman. He looked forward to this encounter every day, and the mutt obviously did as well, though how the little thing had the stamina to chase every bike like that he couldn't imagine. Maybe it chose him. Then one day, as he passed the driveway, and the dog started its chase, a pickup truck passed him going in the opposite direction. Then he heard a thud. He turned around in time to see the dog's body flop over one more time before coming to rest, completely motionless. He coasted to a stop and returned to the little body, along the curb just beside the driveway. It was dead, though unmarked, bleeding from the mouth. The owner soon came out, an elderly man, muttering a few sentences, including an apology of some kind to him. To him? The man picked the dog up by the tail and carried it back somewhere behind the garage. He remembered being upset about this for a long time, for days, perhaps not so much for his own imagined guilt as for the unexpectedness of the event, the finality of it. The evening after this occurred, his mother said to him words to the effect that not only had the little dog died at the most exhilarating moment of its life, at its happiest, doing what it loved best, but also that it hadn't felt a thing, hadn't suffered, and you couldn't ask for much more than that. What was more, it certainly wasn't his fault, and when he got right down to it, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't much of a tragedy. This had helped ease his mind somewhat, but he remembered finding this explanation vaguely unsatisfying. After all, the dog had been alive, and now it was dead. He still found it vaguely unsatisfying, worth remembering, worth thinking about, but unsatisfying. Why the memory of the little dog came to mind just as he was selecting the cuts to be made on a large Cortland tree this morning, he could only guess. It was easy enough to decide why the run-in with the drug dealer had come to mind, that is, aside from his constant concerns for his sons. The bone in his hand, which he had broken in the process, and which had never knitted properly, was beginning to ache, as it did most cold mornings. The price of violence. The Cortland tree was about 20 inches thick at the base and about 16 feet tall. It had a pretty good central trunk, but a competing trunk, facing slightly southwest, had been left and somewhat favored by removing some of the limbs from the main trunk that faced that way. Enough of that. The competing trunk would go, the whole thing. No sense leaving the temptation. Then there was an enormous lower limb towards the east from which 4 posts had been trained straight up, posts from which lots of side branches and fruiting wood extended, as if each post was its own little tree. 2 of them would go. The other 2 would have to stay, since there was nothing left on the main trunk over there to fill in. There were several extra limbs near the top of the main trunk. Thin limbs. Just about all the limb ends hung down too far, never having been picked up enough. Cortlands had that drooping tendency. They were lovely trees. He climbed on the lower limbs and started cutting out the competing center. The big pieces fell through the soft branches of the graceful tree, before thudding heavily to the ground. Then he climbed to the top of the main trunk and started on the extra limbs. The cuts he made never marred the smooth gray bark. This work of his had certainly become almost automatic to him. He had always liked the fact that, as long as he remained attentive and careful, his thoughts were basically free to wander, somewhat like while driving on the highway. Perhaps, he joked to himself, thinking while pruning was more like walking while chewing gum, but he didn't really think so. He had never met a truly good pruner who was also a complete moron. Was that true? Better not think about it too much. In all, he removed about a half dozen of the smaller limbs. 8 or 9 well-placed, well-developed limbs could easily cover a full-size standard. Extra limbs meant that a tree was putting proportionally more of its energy into wood and less into fruit. It meant more shading and more opportunities for disease and insects. Just one small point among many that ultimately might make the difference between a grower staying in business or going under. He knew at a glance which limbs he wanted out and which he would keep, but it was hardly a precise science. You wanted to keep the healthiest limbs that left an arrangement of limbs most staggered on the trunk, preferably a straight central trunk. He cut off the rejected limbs, the smaller ones, by simply cutting them twice, once a couple of feet out from the trunk, and then flush with the trunk, with just the least remainder of the limb, especially at the bottom. As his saw remained quite sharp, the second cuts were rapid enough to keep the falling branch stub from tearing the bark on the trunk below it. His thoughts moved inevitably from his mother's comments about the dog to other memories of his mother, whose own death from cancer only a few years later was anything but brief and painless. It was horrible, nightmarish, and gave the young Les ample evidence of the indifference of nature. Her death was the turning point in his own life. Part 1, Part 2. Before, after. Before, a child for whom, too smart for his own good, was perhaps the worst that could be said of him. But that wasn't really true either, since he was respectful of his elders, whether relatives or not. Other children gravitated towards him. Old-timers took one look at him and wanted to spill their whole life story. After, a miserable, cynical teenager, 9th grade dropout with lots of scrapes with the law. His only remaining intellectual passions seemed to be internal combustion and the physics of launching cars into the woods. Quite remarkable that he had survived his teens. He had long since rejected the stupidity of those years, which was why the incident with the TV set especially irked him. His marital troubles, until now resulting in his wife taking the boys on vacation for a couple of weeks, a couple of times, had generally revolved around money, specifically the scarcity of it. During the 5 months or so every year when he wasn't pruning, there was sometimes a house to paint, or a roof to reshingle. He cut firewood. He picked apples for a month every fall. There was always something to tinker on, particularly since there were always old cars to keep running. Mechanic work didn't bring in much income. Often when he worked on a friend's or relative's car, he barely broke even. What he loved best was spending time with his sons, doing just about anything. He always made time for the boys, particularly during their summer vacation, even if it meant passing up work. His wife, Claire, a nurse who worked 3 13-hour shifts a week, didn't begrudge him the time with their sons, though she wouldn't have minded a chance for more time with them herself. She just couldn't understand why a man who had more on the ball than most of the doctors she worked with wasn't doing more with himself so that they could buy themselves a home in a nice neighborhood and set aside tuition money. Tuition money didn't concern him. Let them do different jobs, including manual labor, to pay their way through college. After a couple of years as a laborer, they'd have the motivation to apply themselves in college. Plus, they wouldn't end up pointy-headed little geeks. And besides, they were setting aside money. So far, almost $600. Maybe that was gone by now. He didn't know. He did know that doing things with his boys was not only the most important thing he did, it might also be the most important thing they did. Often enough, they did purposeful things like build or fix something. But often, too, and what the boys liked best, was exploring. Simply poking about in the woods, actually. Les knew several stretches of woods, like the back of his hand, well enough that he could let them meander where they would, and he was always reasonably sure where they were. Not that that was any great feat. The long ridge where they had most of their excursions had no roads and few houses. The valleys had roads and lots of houses. If you walked downhill in any direction, you were sure to come to one of 2 paved roads. He realized that thinking about summertime rambles with his boys was merely torturing himself. It could do him no good. What would his mother have said about his current situation, he wondered. Not much, perhaps at first. She wouldn't jump right in there with cliches or platitudes or even criticism, though he probably deserved plenty of the latter. He could see her slate-blue eyes staring towards one of the bookshelves in her study, seeming to stare right through the books, the eyes steady, though darting around once in a while. At some point, she would say something, and it would be something worthwhile, perhaps even something that might cut right through the knot in his brain. If he only knew what. He was at least working well today. He spent more time poling the Cortland than he had any of the other trees that morning, standing in the crotch of the lower limbs to reach up and out to the highest branches, to snip back the drooping ends of the fruiting wood. Then he moved rapidly, deftly around the tree, with the snap, snap, snap of the handle accompanying the rhythm of his movements, quickly dancing the hook and blade at the end of the pole, along and around the outer portions of the limbs. Suckers, snap, snap. Fruiting branchlets too close together, snap. Interior downward growth, sure to be heavily shaded and yield only low-quality fruit, snap, snap. The light pole held high around his shoulders, thrusting it in forcefully and yanking it back out. The crude, sophomoric sexual image, not too far off the mark after all. This powerful male intrusion on the more passive, fruitful partner. This seeming assault that leaves the other never more alive, never healthier, ready to bring forth life and sustain life. Then he was on to the next tree, where the hard work of pruning, by far the more important part, would be done with the saw. The pole was for cleaning the tree up, tidying it up, reaching those branch ends that couldn't be safely reached while up in the tree, shortening and thinning them. In and thin. You could always tell novice pruners. Not knowing how to select the larger cuts, they tried to do the job with the pole, nibbling at the tree around the edges, wearing out their arms and necks while staring up into the sun, and not getting the job done for all that. They could walk around a tree like that for an hour and not get it done. That was the problem with that big pruning rig. Despite the fact that the operator could reach the cutting blade just about anywhere, he tended to make lots of little stubbing cuts, not leaving enough emptiness, the right proportion of structure to emptiness. Finished trees were too thick, too uncorrected, too unfinished. Outside in rather than inside out. Sour grapes. Les knew he'd lose his race. That rig would probably do 60 trees in a 10-hour day. He might do 40 if he worked himself half to death. These trees really were a mess. His next tree was a sad little thing. Gravy. Might not even count it. A lot of the semi-dwarves hadn't done well. Mice girdling the roots, nematodes in the soil. He didn't know. Something wrong with them. The trunk on this one took a 90-degree bend a couple of feet up. There was a hole at the bend where the trunk used to be. Rotting already. A foot or so beyond the bend, where all the limbs fanned out, someone had left a sucker that had turned into a reasonable new top, finally drooping over like a side branch about 10 feet up. There was nothing to be done but make a lot of small cuts, hoping to invigorate it a little. Won't count, he decided when he was done. The next was another standard, probably a Macintosh, vase-shaped, with 3 trunks and a few lower limbs left. He shook his head. Gotta live with it, he said out loud, and began to climb. His mother came from Boston. After the war, she moved north to the old mill town where Les was born and raised. She was rumored to be mourning the loss of her fiancé, a fighter pilot, though she never spoke of that at home, and Les still didn't know if there was any truth to it. It was as though she herself dropped out of the sky to grace the town and thoroughly conquer the heart of Percy Maleau, part Abenaki, part French, a veteran of Normandy and the Ardennes forest, a good worker, a good man, second shift machinist at the gear shaper plant, pretty much since coming back from overseas. No reenactment of American history, this relationship, no war of woodland ambush and skirmish, rather a blitzkrieg. Percy had simply been steamrolled and lived in frank admiration of his goddess throughout their 15 years together, until her departure from the scene. She bore him 3 children, first a boy, then a girl, then Les. Percy built her a study in the attic of their home, with a dormer window overlooking the river and the mountain range beyond. It was in this room that Les derived his earliest memories, and some of his most precious. Already her hair was going gray, though he realized now that she would have only been in her early 30s. He would sit on the arm of the soft chair in her study, on the flower-patterned cloth arm covers she'd made from an old bedspread, sit quietly looking over her shoulder. There was a light breeze and an occasional voice or passing car on the street below, and the faint smell of flowers, like a summer field dotted with them, adding a hint of yellow to a dozen shades of green. He reaches his hand out and very lightly places it on the warmth of her arm, then on her wrist, where he can feel the strong, steady pulse, thinking he can hear her heartbeat, but it's only the pulsing of the blood in his own ears. She sits so calmly, so still, slate blue eyes moving rapidly behind funny-shaped glasses, eyes that when engaged with anything else are so steady and confident and loving, but as she reads, they dart back and forth, and she seems to forget the presence of the small boy, transfixed, hypnotized beside her. She clears her throat, criticizes an author, a passage out loud, then giggles self-consciously, noticing him, spell momentarily broken. Les learned to read by her side and on the floor nearby. Later on he did his homework there. School was child's play. Learning went on in his mom's study. It was there he first explored the subtle distinctions between spiritual truth and scientific fact. There he first learned that strength could be measured by what you could ignore or endure, as much as by what you could do or say. There he first learned to beware ideologies that only hold up if their disciples insulate themselves from those who think differently. There that aboriginal societies were contrasted with the supposedly civilized world, with civilization ultimately receiving one more somewhat grudging adherent. It was his veins, after all, that coursed with Abenaki blood. But it was his mother who helped him explore what that meant, since his grandmother on his father's side was dead, and Percy didn't dwell on it. From an early age, he explored books, and he explored those fragments of disturbed nature that he had access to from their home. At first, patches of brush and scrub and sumac by the railroad embankment and the riverbank a couple of blocks from home, but soon on excursions with siblings or friends to the ridge that began a few miles outside town and extended unbroken for about 30 miles, the same ridge he had until recently often walked with his own sons. Learning to love silence, learning to observe animals while unobserved, learning to fish and hunt with Percy, to prepare and eat what they had killed, but never to kill anything without a good reason, or to torment anything. By now he knew how fierce nature actually was, that sooner or later it defeated you, but that didn't change the bottom line. Love nature, even if in the end it seemed more a relentless enemy than a friend. That was his only beef with the Gospels. Too short. They didn't spell out all the details. Love thine enemies, but beware thine friends, regarding life's traumas and crises, facing ridicule, humiliation, all manner of abuse. Fine, fair enough. But what about the miserable business of everyday life, which so often felt like slogging through waist-deep oatmeal? Difficult enough in its own way, vaguely ridiculous, nauseating, often downright absurd. Apparently, that was the deal. That was the price you paid for being able to go fishing with your boys. Since Les had trained so many men over the years, it wasn't unusual for him to find himself going over the whole process in his head as he worked. For starters, it made sense to consider the alternative, the abandoned apple tree. Graceful, flowing lines and soft curves, a worthy subject for the artist's pen. To get it to produce anything edible, he'd have to pump it so full of sprays as to provide a textbook example of the theory of diminishing returns. Not that he had anything against old, abandoned trees. He liked old things in general, and particularly things that most people considered worthless. They kept the past around, kept it alive. They put you in that pleasantly melancholy, reflective state, helping keep things in perspective. The trees that he was pruning were about one thing only, producing fruit. No self-respecting artist would want to sketch them, he guessed. The thought amused him. Aesthetically, they weren't much. Come autumn, they would produce abundantly, would produce with well, anyway. The abandoned tree in the pasture might produce fruit too, especially towards the tops of the sprouts at the top of the tree, each of which might have the size and appearance of a substantial sapling. It would be tricky to perch a ladder up there to pick them, but if you did, or if you just waited for them to drop and looked things over, you'd find misshapen little things, riddled with maggots, gnarled and discolored from fungal infections and insect stings, sandpapery from the residue of mites. Any fruit lower down in the tree, in addition to all that load of pests and afflictions, would have a host of problems related to insufficient sunlight and excessive shading. As more years pass, many or most lower limbs start to look sick, bark peeling, discolored, not growing, rotting from within. The tree keeps growing up, and as lower limbs die off, it becomes increasingly top-heavy. Then heavy, overburdened upper branches split or break in a good wind or ice storm. The whole tree might split. By now, the trunk is partially rotten, if not completely hollow, housing carpenter ants and other larger critters. Gaping holes take the place of limbs, but a few anemic upper limbs with diseased leaves cling to life. The tree might cling to life like that for a very long time, going with the flow. Orchard pruning is all about going against the flow. What could be simpler? Trees grow towards the light. Pruning interrupts the upward progress, favors horizontal growth, lower growth, sometimes downward growth. A tree is just as content to put its energy into buds and branches near the ground as into those higher up, but only if given no choice. Well cared for old standard trees could be enormous things, sometimes over 20 feet tall, with spreads twice the height. Few growers wanted to deal with trees that big anymore, and with good reason. Somebody has to go up there and pick the crop. An old tree that has been allowed to grow to a height of 20 feet or more can't be brought down to 12 or 14 feet in one fell swoop without giving it a shock to its system. You did it gradually over a number of years, making the cut just above the limb or limbs that would represent the new top. Ideally, the same pruner would be making the decisions year after year. Ideally, there would be peace on earth. You never knew who would be pruning any given tree from year to year. This might be the last time this particular tree encountered a saw that was connected to a brain. It helped if the growers knew something about pruning. If they did, you could work conservatively, knowing that year after year good decisions might be made. The overall shape of a standard tree that had been successfully gradually reined in was something like a lampshade, somewhat narrower at the top, by a few to as many as 8 or more feet. This overall shape allows sunlight and air circulation throughout, facilitates spraying. Not least, it creates a good angle for the picker's ladder. The experienced picker climbs the ladder to the top and fills his bucket as he descends. If the upper limbs are as long as or longer than the lower, or if there are lower limbs missing, he picks more slowly and works harder for what he picks, and so makes less money for himself and ultimately for the grower. Pruning an old tree in this way has its risks to the tree, especially if done too suddenly or carelessly. A tree suddenly relieved of a lot of its above-ground wood, but none of its roots, will put on a growth spurt. It can split its seams, growing too fast for the bark to catch up. This leaves it open to pests and disease, as can large cuts where ragged stubs have been left, or careless cuts where bark below the limb tears off as the limb falls. A large, flat, unshaded wound at the top of a tree, where the central trunk has been cut off, can crack open or become sunburned or scalded. So if one wasn't careful, what was intended to keep an old tree in service might end up killing it. Long abandoned trees should be left that way. That's what he invariably told homeowners who asked him to bring back some old monster in their dooryard. That one's for the squirrels, or the camera. It was a good thing to keep old trees like that around, though. Anyway, he liked them. The sun climbed in the clear winter sky, and as it spread its gentle warmth, numb hands thawed, and nearly perfect working conditions settled in. Cold but not frigid, clear and calm. By 9:30, Les had finished his 9th tree, but Gibby and Stu had stopped by to inform him that he was already a tree behind. Herbie had also stopped by for a brief chat, nipping with the pole at a ragged edge of a branch here and there as he talked. He was expecting a local man to stop by. Supposedly an experienced tree man, snap. Looking for work, snap. Didn't expect to hire him, snap. Had enough on his hands as it was, snap. Enough to look after, snap. Couldn't complain though, snap. First year he could remember in a long time where he had enough work and enough men to get it done, snap. Then he was gone. Dave, who had started out more or less side by side with Les in his row, and was now about 4 trees behind, had tried to start a conversation about professional basketball. Hailing from the Philadelphia suburbs, he was partial to the Sixers, and was lamenting the fact that they had lost Malone, since with Malone and Irving they might have had a dynasty. Les didn't care a hoot for professional sports, couldn't even feign interest. A few times he had glanced at a game the boys were watching, where Larry Bird was playing, and seemed to have the whole shebang in the palm of his hands. Les knew excellence when he saw it. He suggested that as long as Bird was around, Boston was the team to beat. The conversation hadn't lasted long, since before much more was said, he had started his saw again. With the saw running, conversation was out of the question. It was satisfying in its own way, listening to the saw running well, idling nice and low, acceleration right there when you touch the throttle, coming up to a nice high whine, no skips, no hesitation. It was an accomplishment in itself to keep a little saw running well, day after day for months on end. Lack of conversation was no hardship anyway. He wondered how many weeks he'd have to go without hearing another human voice before it became burdensome. At the moment, he wouldn't have minded hearing his sons talk about just about anything. Wouldn't have minded a bit. His older boy, Aaron, was 12, and resembled his mother in both appearance and temperament. Luke had just turned 10, and in many ways resembled him. That was somewhat worrisome. What would they be doing this week? Their mother would see to it that they did worthwhile things at least part of the time. With regard to schoolwork, they required little prodding. They were always falling all over each other to show who knew more about what. But part of the time they'd be wasting on TV and video games, and none of the time they'd be spending with him. There was any number of things they might be doing together. The ice was at its thickest on the river right about now. Perch would be biting, maybe pike. They could set some traps for beaver and muskrat. He knew a dairy farmer with a dammed-up portion of stream. The stream bank behind the dam was getting torn to pieces, a portion of the field flooded. Les would get Percy to lead them. He was the expert. He had the traps, though he didn't like going out and setting a line of traps anymore. It would be good for the boys. Aaron was still a bit squeamish about killing things and handling dead things. Not Luke. In another few years, Luke would be able to survive in the woods if he had to. Maybe they'd want to go skiing. He had taken them skiing a bunch of times. He would sit in the lodge by the fire, nestling a beer, trying his best to follow them on the mountain. Not a bad way to spend a day. Not that you'd get those foolish things on his feet. Thinking about the things he couldn't do with his boys this week was beginning to torture him, but it wasn't slowing him down. Nothing would slow him down today, he could tell. He wouldn't have been able to do any of those things with them this week anyway, of course. He couldn't just walk away from work for a week. He could, at that. He could go off any day and line up enough work for himself in the Hudson Valley to fill out the season. He usually made more money working on a crew. Besides, Herbie had just gotten through telling him he finally had the right number of men for the work. It wouldn't be fair to walk off in the middle of the season. Pretty soon half the crew might decide they had to quit too. It often happened just that way. He would stick it out for now. Come April he might give it up, though. He knew a grower up north of Albany, with thousands of young trees, who needed somebody who really knew how to train them. That was pleasant work. Handsaw work, all from the ground. Cutting out whole limbs almost exclusively, and a fine spot, a quiet hilltop with no houses anywhere close. In April the buds would be swelling, fragrant new grass underfoot, the songbirds coming back through, hawks and geese higher up, snow geese blinking iridescent with every flap of their wings, flocks of fair-weather lighthouses, and the days getting longer and longer. He could clear 700 a week without breaking a sweat. Well, he'd break a sweat all right. Still, he couldn't imagine much more pleasant work or working conditions. The first few really hot days in April or May, you spent a lot of time sitting on a stump in the shade swatting black flies, but with 14 hours of daylight and no more bad weather to contend with, plenty of work got done. Come April, he would do that for sure. But this wasn't April, and this wasn't a handsaw job. The old trees had been trained well enough. Most had a straight, sturdy, central trunk, with well-placed limbs radiating out at angles more or less perpendicular to the trunk. Others were vase or bowl-shaped, with 2 or more angled trunks, each with its own complement of limbs facing out away from the center. That was an older system of pruning, not much in favor for apple trees anymore. Phil, the owner, would have done all the training and pruning of the standards way back when. Then at some point someone had come along and done some damage, cutting out good lower limbs, skinning others, leaving suckers all over that turned into posts and robbed the main limbs, turning them sickly or simply overburdening them so that they broke, leaving thick limb stubs all over the place to rot. Phil's boys' handiwork. This was the second time that Phil had hired this crew, and if he had them back a couple of more times, the trees might be more or less straightened out. A lot of the damage couldn't be undone. You couldn't glue limbs back on. He had watched Phil's son in action on a young block beside the storage barn one day. A man about his own age by the looks of him, hard at work ruining his own trees, stubbing up all the young, upward-growing limbs so that they'd never come down to a reasonable angle, then bragging about it at the end of the day. Did, whatever it was, 85 trees today. Les thinking, if I did that in a day, I sure wouldn't brag about it after. He didn't say anything, though. Maybe he should have. Training young trees, though, wasn't that a treat? Like eating ice cream, like eating salted peanuts. Especially if the grower knew something. Especially if the grower did his part. Coming back year after year, seeing how they were shaping up. Well, have we been good this year? Was Santa good to you? Any mice nibbling about your roots? Growing straight and strong? Limb selection, sure, but only after the weight of the first real crops had brought them down, only after they'd survived long enough that a mean ice storm wouldn't do them in. And the limbs selected? Limbs compete with one another just as trees do, so you staggered them up the trunk, almost like a helix or spiral, with the lower tier beginning a couple of feet off the ground, and nothing much directly above it for several feet. Good sturdy limbs that fan out and cover close to half the diameter of the tree for that height. And for the others, a few strokes with the handsaw, sharp as a butcher's saw, and out they go into the row behind you. A few years of that, taking out a handful of limbs each time, and you had your tree. Snip back the center leader up top, where there's a couple of good little side limbs starting. Leave extra limbs for a while, especially up top. Ice and hail could still do damage. Even the crop itself routinely breaks limbs. Then as the tree matures, you start to work each limb. Treat each one like it's its own little tree, a tree in one horizontal plane. Choose good alternating side branches off the main branch. Cut out the bigger stuff that grows up towards the next limb, or downward, or back towards the trunk. Thin out the fruit spurs a little. Then finally you stub it off in the spray row, or at the side where it meets the next tree. Start to bring the upper limbs in tighter than the lower. That's it. On to the next. Do it with as few cuts as possible. That was always hard to get across properly, since if taken to extremes, it wasn't exactly good advice. But it was still true. One of the finer points. Just about every cut sprouts suckers. Every bullseye is an opening for pests. As to what those pests were and how to deal with them, Les left that to the grower. He was a pruner. He would never be a grower. In fact, he had no desire to own an orchard or a farm of any kind. A small house might be nice. If the training wasn't done when the tree was young, it had to be done sooner or later, or the tree became a tangled mess. Bringing back that tangled mess was where the chainsaw came in. The small, light saws that had come on the market in the 60s must have helped keep hundreds of small acreage growers in business. Working with a saw wasn't something to be taken lightly. Neither was it the stuff of horror movies. Loggers often get killed. Pruners occasionally get cut. Les had never been cut, never taken a serious spill. He got scratched once when he left the saw running while it was hanging from his belt. The slowly spinning chain from a badly adjusted carburetor caught the material of his right pant leg and tore it. Tore his pants, that is. He had long since ceased worrying about anything catastrophic happening while he worked, except for the occasional wolf hour dream. Around age 30, he started to have the creeping fear that he might begin to slow down. It hadn't happened yet, and the fear was pretty vague and far down in his mind, brought to the forefront whenever he considered the two men on this crew who weren't yet 40 but had just about had it. He had no idea what he'd be doing in 10 years. Just try to take care of yourself now, he thought. What else can I do? Get out of it, he knew. Do something else entirely, like his wife wanted. Something closer to home. He wasn't really against that. He knew she had a point. He liked to think that he wasn't yet obstinate just for the sake of it. How could he explain that there was something he loved about this work? This work? How could he explain that even to himself? What was there to love about it? All this inning and thinning, one tree after another, hour after hour, day after day, month after month, season after season. He didn't exactly make millions like a star athlete like Larry Bird. He had read somewhere, probably in a magazine article, that Larry Bird had worked on some kind of maintenance or landscaping crew during a year off from college. He'd like this work, I'll bet, he thought. He'd take right to it. Too tall, though. Tall guys like Stu or Fred were always bashing their heads as they climbed and maneuvered around. Anyway, he didn't make millions, but he made a decent wage. The problem was you'd get a stretch of miserable winter weather, and it cut into your work time, and then you were stuck in the trailer or a bunkhouse with guys like Gibby and Stu. He was now 3 trees down in his race, they had just come over to inform him. Didn't they have anything better to do? The sun was nearly as high as it would get. It could hardly be called cold. It felt quite pleasant, and he took off his coat, laying it over a branch. He didn't know his count. He knew he was more than halfway down his first row, and about out of gas again. He filled up and stood before his next tree, looking into it towards the east. It was a standard, but not as large as the others. Planted at some later time, probably, but before the semi-dwarfs. He couldn't discern the variety. By the density of the sucker growth and the scaly pattern of the bark, he guessed it might be a northern spy, except the tips of the newest growth had a reddish hue, deep red. No, it wasn't a spy. There were hundreds of varieties, of which he could identify no more than a dozen from a glance at the leafless tree. This was one of the hundreds that he couldn't. A mess, that's what it was. The very straight, thick trunk was riddled with sapsucker holes, the bark fragmented into small, rectangular, gray-brown shards. It rose to about 10 feet, where it forked in the east-west direction into a precise and distinct Y, the top of which was up around 14 feet. Around this distinct center, it seemed at a glance just a swirling mass of growth, dense, drooping side limbs with sprouts hugging, seemingly choking the trunk. From the upper limbs, sprouts extended through and beyond the top of the trunk for another 4 or 5 feet, tips thrust upward, grasping for light. Had to have been skipped last time through for some reason, he thought. The smaller limbs had a characteristic gentle arc, rising slightly for several feet after leaving the trunk, then leveling and drooping towards the ends, from the collective weight of many crops in succession, like the low shoulders and extended arms of the oldest dairy farmers. Some of the lower limbs looked a little sickly from all the internal competition and shade. That would soon change. But he was still staring at the overall structure of the thing, which almost made him laugh. That Y up near the top didn't bother him. The east and north sides were pretty straightforward. The ground level was pretty well covered, except to the south, where a massive limb emerged from the trunk, only to stop in its tracks a few feet out and send out crossed limbs, one to the southeast, one to the southwest, like a confused scarecrow standing there with crossed arms. The south side itself was served by a single, rather spindly limb, which emerged from the trunk about 6 feet up, then both drooped to ground level and sent out upward and outward components, reaching as high as the base of the Y. It would have to keep doing double duty, nothing else over there. To the west, the top had an arm of the Y, and that was okay. Below the Y were 2 fairly large limbs which sat more or less on top of one another. Then there was a lower limb that started about waist height and rose sharply, forking and branching at about head height. Then there was that thing that came around from the south and itself forked again twice, thoroughly intertwined with everything else. He shook his head and allowed himself a single snorted laugh. Time for a little logging. He fired up the saw and began working the ground, shortening the many overlong branch ends that intertwined with the dead stalks of last year's grasses. He cut off the few ground suckers and brambles just above ground level, and one vigorous grapevine, already reaching up and intertwined with the upper branches. He pulled this all out and into the spray row, mostly to get it out of his way. He approached the trunk and began cutting off the thin, winding water sprouts, the suckers that emerged from the lower limbs, and the lower portions of the trunk. He pulled them out with his left hand and laid them on the ground where he stood, while with his right continuing to sever others at the base. Then he hopped up on the biggest lower limb and continued the process for the rest of the trunk and inner portions of the limbs. Once he had cleared his way, he climbed the scaffold of limbs to the upper hub of the trunk, standing finally in the fork of the Y. He was surrounded with, and even somewhat supported by, the dense growth, which was particularly thick up there. He stood up straight and stretched out his back. Off to the south, he could see for several miles to the broad, low crest of the hill on the horizon. A few unfinished houses stood out like beige specks among the mat of distant, leafless trees. He started the saw again and began severing the suckers at the base, flinging them out of the tree, leaving only a few short fruit spurs and a few of the shortest of the sprouts, which looked like they might begin to droop over and become productive, but at least, in the meanwhile, would cast a little shade for the top of the trunk. With his freedom of movement much improved, he was able to stretch himself out over each side of the Y in turn, leaning on one knee, holding on with his left hand. The productive wood of these upper limbs fanned out and hung down, tangling in the branches below. By cutting off those larger portions of limbs that hung down, and leaving untouched those that were shorter and remained more or less in the plane of the top limbs, he was able to create a neat, tight, well-thinned upper tier, with a few cuts on each side. He shut the saw off and climbed down a little, where he could easily work the middle tier of limbs. The limb facing east was rather spindly and needed little work. Only a little encouragement and positive reinforcement. On the west side, there was the extra limb that lay more or less on top of the one he wanted to leave, and that thing that reached up and around from the lower limb on the south. Amazing that that had been left in there last go-round. Then again, from all the healing overcuts, it was clear they'd done some logging last time, too. No excuse for leaving it this time, though. He made each of these larger cuts in chunks, first cutting off the outer portions, where most of the fruiting wood was located. A few large pieces hung up as they began to tumble out. He shut the saw off and held on with both hands while he kicked one of them out the rest of the way. He'd have to make the last and largest cut from the ground. He made a few more thinning cuts on the west side, carefully cleaning the edges of the cuts, removing the ragged stubs, then shut the saw off and jumped down. He finished the largest cut, again cleaning up the edges, then made a quick circuit of the lower limbs, making an abundance of small cuts, the kind of small cuts he had avoided higher up. One more circuit with the pole, and the tree was done. It had taken a little over 10 minutes. He stepped back and looked at it momentarily, hoping it would be counted among the larger trees. Doubtful. Possible, though. There was an impressive amount of wreckage on the ground. At a glance, it appeared that as much tree had been removed as remained standing. He liked this one, he decided. Not half bad. The west side, especially, looked much improved. He would have signed his name to it if circumstances had allowed. Ah, well. He cleared some felled suckers off a patch of crusty snow on the north side and relieved himself. Close enough. Hervey was back over in Dave's row, getting ready to bring him down to prepare lunch, which Les and a few of the others called dinner. As they started away towards the van, Les let out a piercing whistle, waving that he wanted something brought back. He wouldn't be going down the hill to eat. Bring him up a sandwich. How many? 2? 2. No, 1 was enough. 1. Didn't want to get weighted down. They turned away from him and continued towards the van. Les went back for more gas and oil. It wouldn't matter. He'd run out halfway through the next one anyway. Another Baldwin. The green monsters. Few growers kept them anymore. Phil kept all kinds of older varieties that most others considered worthless commercially. Les admired him greatly. The Baldwin had to be 2 feet thick at the base. It had a well-trained center reaching close to 20 feet, but one enormous lower limb to the southwest had several large posts, which lately had been favored over the limbs from the center. The whole limb was so huge and overburdened it had started to split away from the trunk, making a gash that was intruding far into the trunk. It wouldn't be overburdened in a few minutes. What a monster, though. How could he win his contest with trees like this to contend with? He started the saw. In and thin. It was going well, though, he had to admit. Where were his boys now, he wondered. Getting lunch. Out with their moms somewhere, maybe. Good. Perhaps they were home, messing around with their new used computer, Apple. Did they miss him? Of course. How much? Never mind that. The snow wasn't deep at home either. It would be a beautiful winter day there, too. They could be doing any number of things together. With him, they could go into the woods without using snowshoes, see what kinds of wildlife were out and about. There were fewer deer in the woods near home than when he was a kid. The woods had grown up, grown thicker. The upland and hilltop pastures had grown back to thick stands of pine, poplar, pincherry. But there were lots of interesting things turning up that had never been there when he was young. Fisher cats and otters near the streams and beaver dams. Beavers, for that matter, lots of them now, reclaiming the bottomland, claiming it for their own like refugees returning to the old village. As if the remaining dairy farmers didn't have enough to worry about. There were flocks of turkeys, transplants like the rest of the folks from down country. There were coyotes. They had made it on their own. Trudged east along the highways, like bindlestiffs, getting bigger along the way, apparently. Unlike their cousins out west, they were big and beautiful. Now they were thinning the deer herd the old-fashioned way, to the chagrin of some of the two-legged hunters. One hot summer day, he and the boys had hiked along the ridge for about 6 miles or so. They'd brought only water, and the boys were ready for a rest. So they sat quietly, as they often did, listening to the buzzing deer flies and the soft wind and the occasional car far off. Then there was a distinct, purposeful rustling through the old leaves of the forest floor. Then, standing motionless before them, not 100 feet away, closer to 50 feet away, was a pair of coyotes. They were about the size of huskies, well-proportioned and well-fed, with a glossy, reddish glow to the tips of their fur. unmistakably wild, intelligent eyes fixed them with an alert stare, neither threatening nor fearful. Curious. None of them moved a muscle. They had seen eastern coyotes along roads, crossing roads, dead ones on the roads, but this was different. Probably for the coyotes, too. At least he hoped they weren't in the habit of trotting up to every human they heard in the woods, or they would soon be dead coyotes. This day, all concerned seemed to realize that nobody meant anybody any harm. It seemed clear the animals' curiosity was greater than their hunger. They seemed too fascinated to flee, too wary to approach any closer. It was as if they were asking if they could join the pack. The encounter lasted only a minute, a very long minute. Then Luke gave a couple of little clicks with his tongue, as one would do to call a dog, and they were gone like a shot. Perhaps it reminded them of the sound of a rifle being cocked. Aaron was furious with his little brother, exclaiming, "Stupid idiot," and other mildly peeved exclamations, but Les decided maybe it was a worthwhile experiment. They'd all been thinking roughly the same thing, it turned out, as their excited conversation showed. Here before their eyes was a reenactment, rather a replication of the first encounter between two creatures whose histories were thoroughly intertwined. A first encounter that, in fact, seemed to fit the definition of love at first sight. Eyes riveted, hearts pounding, minds muddled, mingled fear, excitement, and intense curiosity. Creatures meant to spend lots of time together, to spend their lives together. Throughout the first part of the remainder of their walk, whenever they paused and became relatively silent, they would hear the distant rustling of the leaves and see vague, shadowy gleams of reddish-gold fur. Clearly the attraction had been mutual. While sitting on the last stump of the afternoon before returning to the car for the drive home, they talked about the relationship between mankind and the dog family. For the coyotes, it was easy enough to guess the benefits of linking up with an Indian camp or village, where edible scraps and bones might be available around the fringes, with some regularity, providing a scrap of security to what must be a pretty precarious existence. For people, for that tribe or village, for whom any loss of resources might be, to say the least, detrimental, what was the advantage of four-legged hangers-on, particularly before the howl had been transmuted into the defensive bark, before their value as loyal companions and guardians was known? Must be the companionship came first. Maybe they were companions in the hunt. Maybe an Indian boy found a den like the one near the cliffs, only with pups in it, and took out a pup and... "Dad, can we?" No. The boys were thrilled with this adventure, couldn't stop talking about it, and couldn't wait to go back. They were approached by a lone coyote on one other occasion, in a different stretch of woods, but that first time was clearly special. It occurred to him now, as he thought about it, that his anger at his son, that had precipitated his current predicament, was really a moment of jealousy of the technological gewgaws that sometimes seemed to be coming between them. It wasn't even so much what was on the TV or the computer screen, but that was bad enough. Rather their flashiness, their allure. He just couldn't compete, or so he thought. This was neither excuse nor justification, merely an insight, something of note. He wasn't a Luddite, after all. He had watched his share of TV, he used fairly complex machinery, and understood some of it fairly well. Sometimes it just seemed that the intention of some of this stuff, was to make the human mind obsolete and the human wallet empty. Outings with his sons, by contrast, where nothing came between them, seemed the most natural, the most wonderful thing in the world, where speculation, instruction, non-instruction, could proceed in a casual continuum, in which he, Les, was as much the issue as anything done or talked about. While that had at times made him uncomfortable, particularly in the past, if the alternative was that they ended up imitating some idiot pop star, it didn't seem such a bad thing. Now he was kind of proud that they seemed to want to observe everything about him. The way he walked, the way he conversed with a stranger or acquaintance, the way he worked, the way he thought a problem through. They came upon a mortar one time, the stone bowl that the local Indians had used to grind their grain centuries ago. It was enormous, probably several tons. It could never be moved by hand, which was a good thing. Someone had stolen the pestle long ago, though Les had seen it there in his youth. He had known the site for as long as he could remember, and so was able to guide this accidental discovery of the stone bowl on a small plateau in the middle of a dense forest of pine, hemlock, and oak. Just imagine, 500 years ago, and 1,000, and 2,000, a village, a small settlement. A tribe gathers right where we sit. Women grind their meal at the bowl and gossip. Children watch and help and play nearby. Men at their own tasks, near or far away. The forest? Maybe there was no forest. Maybe this was a small clearing. Or a large one. You need clearings to grow most crops. What kind of crops? Read up on it. You tell me. Maybe there was a string of villages around this whole region, an association. Maybe they had their meetings of the bigwigs right near here. And hereabouts, somewhere nearby, their burial mounds, the graves of all those people, our ancestors. They sit silently for a long time. As darkness closes in, Les gets up casually. Time to go. The car is 2 miles away. Another day they return. They find arrowheads, or stones they imagine to be arrowheads, and curved sticks which the boys pretend to have been used for bows. No harm in such fancying. No digging, though. They rest. Time for dinner. Les opens the pack. Nothing. He must have forgotten the food at home. What to do? Go back. That's the prudent thing to do. A protest. A threat of mutiny. Well, what then? It must be 1 o'clock. We have to eat something. They sit quietly for another minute. Les checks the pack again. Finds a tiny fishhook on about 6 feet of light line. 2 hours later, they have half a dozen small brook trout, a handful of last year's butternuts and beech nuts, some wood sorrel and young leaves from other plants he knows to be safe. They get a fire going, manage to cook the fish on green sticks like marshmallows. When they're done eating, they're barely less hungry than when they began. Imagine having to get your food like that for every meal, every day. Winter, too. How would we manage? They protest. We could make bows and arrows and hunt larger animals. We could set traps and snares. That's true. We could go down to a bigger stream and catch bigger fish. True enough. We could make a net and take it to the river and catch thousands of gigantic fish. Wouldn't be very easy, though, would it? Then they're silent. Les starved himself once for about a month and a half. He was a teenager at the time. Wanted to see his own skull, he told someone who was as appalled as he was now at the memory of it. Towards the end of it, he had constant stomach pain. He was irritable and lightheaded. He was always on the verge of rage, which in itself was nothing unusual. He couldn't sleep, and when he could, he dreamed of food. No fun. He decided there was nothing wrong with most teenagers that a good dose of near starvation wouldn't cure. He hadn't done that again, except for much shorter periods. For shorter periods, it wasn't a bad thing to do at all. On another occasion, they're going camping for the weekend, and he forgets the tent. Facing the prospect of late autumn rains, they quickly learn how to assemble a passable shelter. Another time, he forgets matches, but has brought a striking rock, and shows them how to find dry tinder and get a fire going under almost any condition. But he's no backwoods know-it-all. His hundreds of I don't knows become opportunities for the boys to do some research and teach him something. Stories as it grows dark. No, he doesn't want to. They are insistent. He's tired. They threaten him with dousing, threaten him with auto da fe. What kind of story? A scary one. He really doesn't want to tell them scary stories. Life is scary enough. But he knows that boys will scare each other half to death no matter what. So he agrees finally, reluctantly. He once heard about... No, he doesn't want to tell it. They'll have nightmares and want to go home. Now the crowd is getting ugly. Preparing the stake, preparing the ropes. All right. You remember that tree about a mile from here? That rotten old maple with big holes in it that looks like a miserable old face, looks like it's screaming, like its toes are getting roasted a couple 100 feet underground? You know the one. Well, that's rumored to be, he can hardly get the word out, a boger. A what? What's that? Leaning in, all ears. I better not tell you. All right. A boger is a tree. Yeah, so what? What kind of a tree? A boger is a tree that used to be a person. Now you can hear every little forest sound on top of the sound of the fire. Yeah, that old maple, that used to be, they say that was Isaiah Rink. Who? Who's that? Mr. Isaiah Rink. Farmed up here almost 2 centuries back. You know that cellar hole? Just the rock walls, with some scraggly old rose bushes in the woods nearby. That was his place. The story of Mr. Isaiah Rink proceeded in a meandering fashion, since Les didn't know it himself before he started telling it. Proceeded well enough just the same. It seems Mr. Rink had grown up on a hill farm nearby, left as a disgruntled teenager to pursue a career at sea, served in various capacities on whaling ships, returned after 15 years to the farm of his birth, found that both his parents had long since died and left his sister and brother-in-law heirs to the farm, having assumed, as he himself had written several times, that Isaiah was a successful captain with no interest in the old place. Isaiah mills about, grumbling, feeling sorry for himself, notices the neighbor's farm, a much better spread, says out loud to no one in particular those fateful words, "I'd give anything to get my hands on that place." Needless to say, a funny-looking little man turns up, smelling heavily of perfume that can't quite mask the odor of sulfur. He has brought along a smooth-sounding proposition and a contract that Isaiah, after thinking about it for not nearly long enough, signs in blood on the dotted line. That same week, a suspicious fire burns the farmhouse in question to the ground. The family who lived there escapes intact, but as they didn't have the money to rebuild, and were already mortgaged to the hilt, or in hock up to their eyeballs, as Les put it, the place is auctioned off. A tall, pale, scrawny guy, nobody's ever seen before, keeps bidding until he has it, signs his name in archaic script, followed by, "On behalf of Isaiah B. Rink," pays in gold doubloons, then walks off, and at a distance seems to descend a staircase right into the ground, accompanied by a puff of smoke. Isaiah Rink has his land, but isn't feeling too good about it. He lives his life out in the burnt-out, damp cellar hole, salvaged timbers and boards for a roof, a leaky little stove for heat. All he ever eats is cold, soggy oatmeal and rotten cheese. The place stinks of methane, rotten eggs, and charred meat. His only companions are rats and toads. Crows and owls are always perched outside, squawking at him, keeping him awake day and night. He becomes a miserable, crabby curmudgeon, old before his time. All he can ever think about is that contract he signed. Of course, the funny little perfumed man returns one day. Isaiah's time is up. He bawls, he pleads, he sobs. "Ain't there no way I can get out of this? Ain't there no way?" The man snickers. "Certainly, my good fellow. All one has to do is arrange not to die." "Well, by God, mister, if there's anything you can do along those lines." The man frowns, scratches his beard, mutters to himself, says something about "have to think about it," and "highly irregular." Then disappears, but returns the next day with an addendum to their agreement. Isaiah signs without even glancing at it. The man studies the signature, mumbles, "Very good. Everything in order. Come along after me." They proceed outside, where the mysterious visitor seems to look about the yard, studying the ground for the right spot, the right soil conditions, as it were. Appears satisfied at last at a distance of 30 yards or so from the cellar hole. Unceremoniously picks up old Isaiah with the strength of a giant and slams him down feet first at the chosen spot, rooting him firmly. That's that. Mr. Isaiah Rink becomes a boger, a rotten-looking, knotty little tree that grows sickly and slowly, but lives and grows nonetheless, and keeps on living no matter what. He's still in there, miserable as ever. More so, because now he can't move a muscle, can't even twitch, can't even scratch himself, and a bunch of little mischief makers are down there underground, lighting matches and holding them up to his toes, his roots. Anyway, he's got plenty of time to think about his contract now, because that tree just goes on living. Somebody tried to chop it down once, swung his axe into it, got a jolt like he'd been bit by about 5,000 volts. Nobody's messed with it since. And when that old tree finally keels over, completely rotten, there's another sickly little sapling right there to take its place. Same old boy, still in the same old pickle. They were quiet for a minute. "What about his body?" Luke asks finally. "Oh, they found that. Down in the cellar hole." "I thought you said—" "Oh, sure, his body died all right. Like I said, he didn't read the fine print. He's buried in that cemetery by the car." More silence. "Of course, it's only a story. Nothing to it. Well, we'd better hit the hay." Sure enough, next day, there in the old cemetery near the car, is the headstone, Isaiah B. Rink, 1778 to 1831. Nothing else. No epitaph. "Nothing to it," he says again quietly as they pass by and approach the car. They didn't say a word in the car. The boys slept with the light on for a couple of nights, but they could hardly go hiking or camping after that without demands for more stories of the bogers. In over 2 years, he'd added only 3 more. The stories of Seth Widget, Ezra Scalotium, and Joshua McReek. None of them had headstones. He much preferred to steer them towards actual stories from history. Often he brought along in the knapsack a book about the settlers or the Indians, or the land, or some combination of the 3. He would find them in his mother's old study in Percy's house, where he had been spending more time in recent years. He could go back in there now. It was still a wonderful room, undoubtedly the finest gift Percy ever gave her. He had been spending more time with Percy of late, too. Percy could do anything with metal, and was a better-than-average backyard mechanic. They rigged a block and tackle to a ceiling joist in the garage for pulling engines. They tore down and rebuilt carburetors, alternators, starters. Percy was good at chasing down elusive electrical problems. Very patient. He didn't trust the new computerized ignitions yet, for some reason. Use your own brain, he liked to say. Percy still worked his machinist job, second shift. He could have long ago switched to first, but preferred the second as it left his days free for odd jobs such as snow plowing, yard work, and apple picking, the job that started Les working in orchards. At the time, he was just trying to give the boy something useful to do, since he seemed intent on going down the tubes. The other children had adjusted. He had adjusted. Why couldn't Les? Your mother wouldn't have wanted to see you. Nothing got through his thick skull back then. Throughout the 1950s and into the early 60s, there was a noticeable improvement in the Valley Chronicle, their local weekly. Even more noticeable was its sudden decline thereafter. All at once, a number of regular contributors gave it up, fell completely silent. Irvin Smythe, the farm and garden correspondent, Gladys Gilsum, who wrote a folksy column with tidbits of local stories, lore, poems, tall tales, proverbs, and aphorisms. Doris Hendricks, who wrote one column with advice for housewives, such as how to freeze eggs, or how to get the starch off your iron, and another which summarized and edited the items submitted by each of the surrounding small towns, and the infamous Adrian Schenk, who gleaned the news services for issues ranging from social trends to advancements, scientific, political, and geopolitical, and passed judgment in such a strident, emphatic tone that there was always a steady stream of letters to the editor suggesting he run for statewide office, and others demanding his head on a pike. Few noticed the odd coincidence that all these voices fell silent after Emma Maleau became gravely ill. Few noticed that at about the same time, the paper became stylistically more awkward, its text, photos, and advertisements less harmoniously arranged, the dramatic increase in typos and misspellings. The owners noticed the decrease in ad revenues and the gradual decline in circulation. Les noticed, though he was only 10 at the time. He noticed because, for as long as he could remember, he would sit there with her in her room as she took up each of these topics in turn, became each of these writers, each with his or her own distinctive voice, then set it all aside and took up her work in a single thick notebook with only some old diaries and letters to refer to. Les would usually be asleep by then. Sometime around midnight he'd be woken up gently and sent off to his room as she herself packed it in for the night. She never finished that work, whatever it was. It was still in there with the diaries and letters in the corner of her study. The newspaper muddled on without her, as did the library, as did the Reverend Shattuck at the Episcopal Church, whose ghostwriter she had been and whose sermons suddenly became flat and lifeless, as did the PTA, as did her family, as anyone will adjust to groping around in the twilight when a particularly brilliant light is extinguished. At such a young age, Les couldn't fully grasp everything she worked on, but he understood that she had a lot on her mind, and he took it upon himself to make her life easier, becoming by the age of 5 her lieutenant, chief of staff, second in command, on-call jury, and sentencing judge. He showed no mercy. The troops had to be kept in line. Even in the most benevolent of dictatorships, the law must have its enforcement arm. So, for example, when she, in the mildest tone, let it be known that it was time for the kids to wash up and set the table, he would deliver the order emphatically, and if there was the least hesitation, end with a threat, such as, "Right now, or no dessert for a month." An abuse of his authority, perhaps. Anything to make the boss's life easier. To hold the privileged position at the right hand of power is to try to understand the leader's thinking, to interpret, to intuit, so that one simply knows what the leader is thinking before she has thought it, knows what needs to be done before she knows it herself. It was good training. He might have made a good mid-level bureaucrat in the diplomatic corps, chief of staff to a general or senator. It seemed unlikely now. Saved from that fate. In order to understand the mind of the leader, he had to do his best to understand what she worked at so diligently evening after evening. There were wire service reports, a number of magazines, extension service bulletins, handwritten scraps from local correspondence, letters, a vast array of stuff. By the time he was 8, he was reading her finished typescript, and so he had a preview of the paper every week. He, like so many others, liked Adrian Schenk's column best. You name the topic, the old boy would spout off. They even had a drawing of him beside the column, looking like Pa Kettle with a bad hangover. Thinking back on it, a few of these columns still came to mind. Years before the famous Surgeon General's report, Schenk was raging that "'tis common knowledge that cigarettes kill millions every year, but that powerful forces are at work to mislead the public." With all the hubbub about cigarettes in the past 20 years, he was often reminded of that one. Les couldn't help wondering what old man Schenk would have had to say about Vietnam, Chappaquiddick, Watergate, the 60s. At any rate, he wouldn't have minced words. Les understood that his mother, who was a sort of intellectual Eisenhower Republican, and generally quite tolerant, was assuming a character role when she spoke as Mr. Schenk and the others, and this in itself was something of a revelation. School really had nothing that could compete with her. She started him on Dickens and Joyce when his classmates were struggling with Dick and Jane. She brought home books from the library with artists' prints, and her enthusiasm was clear as they studied them, with exclamations like, "Just look at the level of detail he's put into the handle of the sword, just the handle. How it glows," as though the picture had been endowed with a self-perpetuating source of light and warmth. He didn't remember her exact words. He remembered that she had looked away quickly after catching his eye, as though she'd said something vaguely heretical. She brought him with her to visit all the real Mr. Schenks, the men and women whose stories and tales found their way into the paper. She staged plays at home, including the children and their friends, even getting Percy into the act. She never shrank from direct instruction, but she refrained from oversimplified answers to the unfathomable, the unutterable, the just plain irreconcilable, saying instead things like, "It takes time to understand some things, lots of time," or "That's beyond me." She wasn't lying or being intentionally cryptic. She was respecting her children's intelligence, something she did consistently and to a rare degree. Then, in what seemed the blink of an eye, she was gone. Her final illness lasted almost 6 months, beginning with a 3-week stay in the hospital. After that, she remained at home. Her hair went from prematurely gray to white. Her blue eyes still glowed from deep in their sockets, as what remained of her body seemed to waste away. She was in constant pain and discomfort. And then she was gone. During the 1.5 years after her death, it was Les who more or less held things together. His edicts now had an oracular quality. Mom would have said, they grew somewhat afraid of him, particularly when he emerged from her study after doing his homework or reading a book. As life settled down to new routines, as Percy grew more comfortable being seen with his new girlfriend, as his brother got his driver's license and started cruising around with his buddies, and his sister did her best to steal those buddies from him, Les packed it in. Quit. Completely lost interest. Life was a bad joke. God, if he existed, should be ashamed of himself. He should get a new job. It took 5 years for this essentially self-pitying state to work itself out through its predictable stages until he finally, miraculously, emerged on the other side in a state, if not of grace, at least of acceptance and dim hope. He remembered one especially uncomfortable, sleepless night in the hospital when torment gave way to inexplicable, seemingly infinite joy. The word forgive kept repeating in his mind, forgive. And then the obvious, ask forgiveness, beg forgiveness. Magic words. Percy took him back in. Les had long since dropped out of school and had no interest in going back, but he did return to his mother's study and set things in order. Opening the New Testament to the last page in which he had inserted a bookmark, he began to read. Words that, as a child, had seemed vague or simply unimportant, burned with a brilliance and lucidity he never would have imagined possible. He wept with joy. In the hospital again, this time to have half his ruined stomach removed, the young nurse asks, "Where do you live?" He takes the pad and pen from beside the bed, in a few clear strokes draws a broken-down shack. "That's my house," he says, and seems to hear an echo, for she says, "That's my house," simultaneously. He looks at her. She is blushing to the roots of her hair. Her hair is extraordinary. It is striking. Neither red, nor blonde, nor gold. All the gradations of the color of tea in the bottom of a white cup, tipped sideways a little. Brilliant honey color where it emerges, then seemingly more auburn. It trails down her back in a single long, thick braid. Claire is 5 years older than he, from Quebec. She has just arrived in the States not 3 months previously. Within another 3 months, they were married. 13 years had passed. There was a sprinkling of gray in his wife's lovely hair. She was nearly the age when his own mother had fallen ill. Unfortunately, their first simultaneous sentence had proven prophetic. They had now lived in half a dozen apartments and 2 trailers, and had never owned their own place. They had never managed to save money. What was more, though his commitment and fidelity to her had never wavered, he couldn't deny that the boys were more important to him now. Perhaps that was true for her also. Perhaps that was precisely her justification for taking them from him. Whatever the true motivation, it was brilliantly cruel. Where were the boys now, he wondered. What were they doing? He had no idea. There were 3 small red delicious trees left in the row. Nothing to do in them but remove the suckers and pick up the ends. Gravy. They'd probably count for 2. Then there was an opening, a clearing. Beyond the clearing were more trees, still in the same rows, but completed already as a separate block more than a week ago. With these last trees, his count would be 13 and 12. For most of the crew, that would be a solid day's work. He still had more than 4 hours of daylight left, and would use every minute. If he finished his next row, the one just beside him to the west, which had been left open for him as the men jumped to new rows, his count for the day would be 25 and 22. He wouldn't be able to. He hadn't slowed down, and he wouldn't. There just weren't enough hours of daylight. The van returned to the top of the hill as he was finishing the row. Hervey brought him 2 grilled cheese sandwiches wrapped in a napkin and a quart soda bottle filled with water. He lingered for a few minutes while Les went back for his coat and made himself comfortable on a flat stretch of dry, frozen ground in the direct sunlight with his coat spread out underneath him. The pleasant winter sunshine contrasted sharply with the frozen ground. He unwrapped one sandwich and slipped the other one in the pocket of his coat. Hervey had a tale to relate as he hovered around Les's picnic spot. A local tree man had indeed stopped by to see him late in the morning, checking on the possibility of work. Hervey had shown him some completed trees in Benny's row, let him watch Benny work for a minute, told him how the system worked, typical prices. The man had snorted at this and said, "That's where we've got problems." Hervey mimicked the man's heavy Boston accent as he related his words. Then the man had gone into a long spiel about how he was an artist, how he never did more than 1 or at most 2 trees a day, but made at least $200, how he took his time and did a good job for good people, you know, estates and such. Then for good measure he had added the clincher. Actually, this wasn't nothing but garbage work, Hervey related, then repeated garbage work a couple of times to emphasize the contemptuous tone of the visitor, his own mockery of the man's Boston accent, his own contempt for the world the man represented, and his indignation at being dismissed in this way. Then Hervey recalled his own response, and Les guessed that parts of it had grown clearer and sharper with a number of retellings, despite its youth. Pruned here, fleshed out there. "Now you listen to me," I says. "My men don't need no joker around, out for a lark, out for a picnic, trying to sell them on some scamway deal while they're trying to make a day's pay. He says, I got 8, 9 guys out in all kinds of weather, the worst months of the year, trying to make an honest living so they can support their families. Ha! I don't imagine you told them some of these guys couldn't burn up their money any faster on weekends if they used gas and matches. Ha! No. Anyway, I says, no, I guess we don't need no jokers hanging around. Now you clear off quick. Les guessed this last sentence had been made up out of whole cloth, but he nodded encouragement. Artist, he says. Garbage work. No, guess we don't need no jokers hanging around. They heard the pruning rig of Les's competitor fire up again, paused to listen to it for a minute. Tom, the third resident of the Pickers' quarters, had joined the conclave halfway through Herbie's story. He put a pinch of snuff in his lip. Les had been considering whether to eat his second sandwich. Instead, he said to Tom, Let Daddy have a pinch. The young man grinned his half-empty grin and held out the can. You ain't gonna whip that rig lying there, he said. I ain't gonna whip that rig under any circumstances, pup, Les said, settling the tobacco in his mouth. He stood up, and as he did, Herbie said, Well, with a sharp little upward note, and the men separated. Les gassed up the saw and brushed up the chain, though it wasn't dull, but neither was it as sharp as he liked. He didn't need any excuses for slowing down. Gibby and Stu found him there and informed him that he had picked up 3 trees by skipping lunch, but had now slipped one and so altogether was still down by 3. He quickly fell into the rhythm he had worked with right from the start, neither working hastily nor in any way falling off the pace. He could easily keep it up for 4 more hours, but he couldn't pick it up without endangering himself in some way. He guessed that his competitor in the pruning rig need only up the throttle to go a little faster, which he'd probably be doing as the afternoon drew to a close, and so leave him far behind. He thought about what Herbie's visitor had said, and he decided that maybe they were artists in some way, though in what way he couldn't say. Something creative about the work, he thought, and shrugged. He climbed to the top of the tree and started the saw. There was a feeling he got on tackling a tree and pruning it well, a sense which he could best equate with only 2 other things, the act of love and that of hunting down a prey animal, entering the other completely and taking something vital, but not merely taking, and not taking casually or thoughtlessly or selfishly, such purposeful taking that somehow it becomes giving. He put the brakes on his analogy. How were you giving an animal anything when you had just hunted it down? Maybe in some grand scheme of things kind of way, in some Darwinian fashion. Anyway, enough of that. He was a farm laborer, he knew. Merely a farm laborer. But there was something worthwhile about it. And as for pruning 1 or at most 2 trees in a day, he wished he could afford to do that, even as he realized that the efficiency of the way he worked was one of the finest aspects of his expertise. Still, to take his time and linger over a single tree, not worry about production at all. It would never do, of course, not in orchards that were on the edge financially as it was. Kind of a nice idea, though. The afternoon passed in tranquility, a sort of battlefield tranquility. It remained fairly cold out. There wasn't a cloud or a breath of wind. A lovely winter day. A day such that those who habitually shield themselves from winter find something to do outdoors, at least for a few minutes. The horrific, purposeful din of chainsaws ripped the air, punctuated by the metallic snapping of the pole handles and the occasional shouted comment or laughter. Les, wearing his hearing mufflers over his knit cap, being at the very center of the din, was hardly aware of it, except for brief moments. Gibby and Stu reported back to him seemingly every few minutes, though actually only a few times over the course of the afternoon, regarding his steadily sinking prospects in the contest, always speaking in that vaguely irritating, mocking tone, that tone with which they seemed to approach everything, and which seemed to sum up their whole worldview. But Les was working too well to notice that either, or to care in the least that he was back, now 2 and 2, and now 2 and 3, and now 3 and 3. The hydraulic-powered rig seemed to have picked it up a notch, but so had he, as the sun dipped low and then fell behind the trees, and then the horizon. As he neared the end of his second row, nearly doubling the production of several of the others, he found himself still behind by 6 trees as the light went out of the day and the saws fell silent. A few voices addressed him as they went by on the way to the van, both sympathetic and somewhat awed, since 22 dense, huge standards and as many full-sized semi-dwarfs, completed in such a way that not a soul who knew anything about it could doubt the skill and sense of craftsmanship of the worker, was a pretty fair day's work, to say the least, especially for a winter day. And if he had come up a little short, there was no one who had watched him work that day who could fault his effort or enthusiasm or commitment to the task. It would be recalled. It would be brought up and commented upon in a number of ad hoc circles of men in the next few weeks, talked about in those circles which can, given the right conditions, yield a single, raucous, noisy, laughing voice. One voice, not a man, not quite a beast, a creature unto itself, somewhat fearsome, a group of guys, precursor to a mob, would be talked about, in short, a lot. How Lester Maleau, Lord, could that boy work trees, nearly whipped one of them big pruning rigs, one of them mobile rigs with a bucket, and that rig left stubs all over, barely thinned out, all leggy and ragged looking. No, them things weren't half done, and Les very nearly whipped it anyway. I tell you what, Mr. Man, that boy could work. That was a sure thing. That was how it would be, except for one thing. Les sat there at the end of the day, dog-tired he had to admit, sat on his coat on the ground, and when the voice that addressed him belonged to the cook, yelled back, "Pup! Pup! Bring me up another sandwich. Just one." Les didn't look at him anymore. He sat there, drank some water, took the sandwich out of his pocket and ate slowly as twilight turned to dark. And then his other sandwich arrived, and he ate that too, and then put his coat back on and waited a little while longer, while it grew cold and quite dark, and then lighter as the moon, already high above the horizon, seemed to gain in luminosity in the crisp winter sky, unshaded but circled by a ring of ice. Les left his chainsaw beside the gas can and returned to his first row, where he found his handsaw where he'd left it hanging on a limb. In the dim blue glow of the moonlight and the reflected glow of the crusty snow, he climbed into his next tree and continued to work. Very slowly at first, then smoothly and steadily, though much slower than the pace he had kept all day, no longer making the largest corrective cuts. He continued for as long as the light allowed, about 6 more hours, doing only about 1 big and 1 little tree per hour, until he aches in more places than he doesn't. But he has finished his second row and moved on to his third, the next row west, and finished several more trees in that one. As the moon descends behind the filigree of forest limbs and it becomes too dark to see clearly, he hangs the pole up high from a small limb, hangs the handsaw and belt over the pole handle, and walks back down the hill, in a slate-blue world, soundless, except for his boots on the frozen ground and the ringing in his ears. Chapter 2. In the Trailer. A little later that morning, as he lay in his bunk half asleep, they looked at him with a kind of quiet amazement, a few odd stares, some smiles and shakes of the head, quiet comments. It ain't only that he did more. Look at the trees. His are done. Something like love and admiration in their glances. Les pretends not to notice. He drifts out and into the smoky, breakfast smell-filled room, now nodding off, now more or less awake. After they all go out and pile into the van, the trailer falls silent except for the refrigerator. Now he can really go back to sleep for another hour or two, but of course he can't sleep. His mind is racing, he's a little achy, his forearms and hands are numb, his elbows and shoulders ache, his neck and back ache, his shins are bruised and scraped up. So he gets up, puts his clothes on, has his spoonfuls of cottage cheese, cod liver oil, vitamin tablet, a little container of yogurt, and a few swigs of orange juice, and goes down out the door and back up into the orchard. He took his share of breaks that day, stood around the van, the gas can, hung out. He worked with Tom on one of his trees and Dave on one of his, pointing and nodding or shaking his head, then looking the finished trees over with them from the ground. You could have left that limb in there, 'cause you could bring the tree down to there real easy in a couple of years, not hurt a thing. Now it's got to stay up there where you left it, or come all the way down to there, see? Kind of left a hole, too. Now look down here. This limb could cover this whole half of the tree, but now you stubbed it up and left this thing in there instead. No, I'd say you got to live with it now that you did it that way. I'm trying to show you how to think it through. Something to think about for next time. For all his goofing off that day, he still did 12 big and 14 small of his own trees, which was more than 4 of the men, and fewer than 3 others. The weather was the thing. It was a nice enough day, a little warmer than Tuesday had been, but breezy, increasingly windy. By the early afternoon, icy-looking high clouds were moving in from the west. It grew dark early. Despite the approaching storm, perhaps in part because of it, a buoyant mood prevailed all day. A mood made almost joyful by the reaction of the owner of the big pruning rig to the previous day's final, official count, claiming that they were trying to pull some kind of stunt, that he had clearly won. Hearing this, Les shrugged. Let the poor guy have the 50. He needs a little boost, apparently. That was the clincher. Les had whipped him every which way. A joyful, playful day, but a storm was coming. They had finished the crest and would soon be in the shorter rows on the western slope. There was less than half a day's work for the crew over there. Even if they lost all of Thursday, they could still finish up on Friday. Then what? The storm would be a fast mover, the reports said, and would be followed by the warmest weather of the winter by Friday. Mid-50s and sunny. Beach weather. Might just as well keep moving south rather than back up north. Down to Virginia Beach, right, Herbie? Herbie flicked his ashes into his supper dish, which had only a couple of pieces of gristle and bones from the pork chops. I ain't exactly sure yet. Going back up north for sure. Maybe to Groton, maybe to Millington. A strong gust rocked the trailer and made a deep noise like an inferno against the windows. The tables were still packed with men, leaning over their plates, finishing supper, glancing up now and then at the TV. A few more, including Les, sat on the edge of the lower bunks, farther back, with their plates on their laps. Stu turned from his seat near the TV to face the crew boss. Herbie, Dave says we need some groceries. Let me and Gibby take the van and get 'em tonight. We'll never get out tomorrow. Herbie considered the matter for a minute before answering. Fill the gas cans while you're at it, and use Benny's car. That way if you hit a tree and blow up, won't be no loss. A voice thundered from one of the lower bunks. Nobody's taking my car. Give me a minute, I'll drive him myself. You ain't in no shape to drive. What did you do, anyway? The bearded man across the aisle from Herbie said. Caught a sucker. The old pruner held a damp handkerchief up to his eye. Smoke from his cigarette curled around his head, shrouding his face. Maybe you better just go along as a passenger. See to it they follow the traffic ordinances and such, the bearded man said, chuckling. Come on, Benny. Snow could start any time. Benny stood up from the bunk, snuffed his cigarette out on the floor, and shuffled up the aisle, still holding the handkerchief up to his face, grimacing. He re-wet it at the sink as he passed. The 3 men who bunked in the pickers' quarters stood up from the tables and prepared to go outside. No extra stops. Hervey! Now look what you've gone and done, Gibby said. There, Stewie. Herbie didn't mean it, did you, Herbie? Course not. The 4 men filed out, Stu picking up a short list from under a magnet on the refrigerator as he passed. This all, mother dear? He said to Dave. The cook, hemmed in at the sink as they went by, managed to nod, then continued to do the dishes as they went out. Their voices and cackling trailed off. Another man came in, stooped in the aisle to avoid hitting his head on the ceiling, and walked back to his bunk. He adjusted a tiny set of headphones over his ears and tuned in his radio, and then sprawled out and brought one forearm up to cover his eyes. Les got up from his seat on the edge of a lower bunk, took a damp sponge from the sink, and wiped down the tables, showering the crumbs onto the floor. He picked up a broom by the refrigerator and swept the length of the aisle and under the tables and worked the pile of debris to the door. He opened the door and sent it flying out into the cold with one great sweep, tidying up the steps afterwards. He set the broom back in its place and turned to the cook. "Where's your saw?" Dave looked up from the dishes. "Van. Under the second seat, on its side. Got my initials scratched on the side plate." Les stepped out, and a minute later they heard the muffled, rhythmic bursts of low chugs as he pulled the starter cord. The saw didn't start. A minute later, Les came back in with the saw in one hand and a few sheets of old newspaper under the other arm. He spread the newspaper on the dinner table nearest the TV, set the saw down, and retrieved a small box of tools from under one of the bunks, and then sat down at the table with the saw in front of him. "What's wrong with it?" the bearded man, who was at the other end of the same table, asked. "Won't run," Les quipped. "Oh, It just ran worse and worse as the day went on," Dave explained. "Couldn't start it at all later in the afternoon." "Oh. Well, for one thing, you're trying to cut wood with a bicycle chain," Les said in a somewhat irritated-sounding tone as he examined the chain. "Should sharpen it every few months or so, pup." "Whether it needs it or not," the bearded man added. "I sharpened it just last week." "Oh, well, he sharpened it just last week, Pete." "We stand corrected," Pete said, chuckling again. "Last week." Les had the side cover, bar, and chain off and was scraping out all the oily wood chips and sawdust from around the sprocket and the body of the saw, first using a screwdriver, then wiping everything down with a rag. With the wrench side of the tool, he unscrewed the spark plug and examined it. He held the plug up for Pete to see. Kinda oily. Got poor compression?" "Seemed to offer a fair amount of resistance. I don't think he's killed it yet." They're hard to kill. I'd say your problem's somewhere else." Pete handed the plug back to Les. Les sanded the plug a little and wiped it clean, then tightened it back into the saw. He pulled the choke lever to the closed position, and then removed the screw of the air filter cover. Another pile of chips and sawdust tumbled out. The fibrous filter was filled with brown flecks. He held the filter towards Pete. Pete nodded. "When'd you clean this last?" Les asked. "Couple weeks ago," Dave said quietly. "Tch. Boys gotta learn," Pete said. "Can't cover no ground with tired equipment." Les brought the dirty filter outside with a can of ether, returning a minute later with the filter nearly white. "Don't bring that thing back in here all full of starting fluid," Herbie said. I shook it out. "I can still smell it." Les replaced the filter and cover. "You'll live," he said. He quickly unscrewed the plug again and brought the saw back outside with the spark plug hanging from the coil wire. He gave the engine a few more cranks and brought the saw back inside. "He's got spark." He set the saw back down. "So..." "Right," Pete said. Les took off the gas cap and fished out the rubber gas line, using a hooked wire. "Ah," he said, studying the cylindrical filter at the end of the line. It, too, was dark brown. "There's your culprit," Pete said. "You got off easy." "Starved for gas," Les said, taking the filter off and starting to walk back outside with the can of ether. "Pretty basic stuff." When he came back in, he immediately reassembled the saw and started filing the chain. Ain't you even going to try it first? You got us all in suspense, Pete said. Thought I'd keep you there for a while. Besides, I think that's it. He gave the teeth a half dozen or so swipes each with the file, sometimes adding a couple more after inspecting them. Maybe you got to tear down that carburetor. Think positive. You still going to look at my tractor? Hervey asked. Why not? Les said. You in a hurry? Planning on using it this spring is all. First spray's in May, early May, maybe late April. You want to get yourself a real tractor, not that old toy, Pete said. Too late now. That's what I got, and that's what I'm going to use. He took a drag on his cigarette. At least this year. What's it doing? Can't hardly start it. Got to crank and crank till the battery's about dead. Then she'll run okay once you get it started. Maybe half hour, 45 minutes. Then it starts to run real bad. Pretty quick she'll quit. Once she quits, that's it. You're done for the day. Can't start it no matter what you do. That thing got a magneto? Les asked, and Pete nodded, mumbling coil under his breath. I guess so. I think so, Hervey said. What'd you do so far? Les asked. Well, somebody said they thought it was overheating. He waited for Les or Pete to say something or nod, but neither did. So I took the radiator off and had that tested. They said it was fine. Perfect. Uh-huh, Pete said. So you said maybe the timing's way off or the carburetor's out of adjustment. So I adjusted the timing. How'd you do that? Under the distributor cap, there's a plate that covers up the gears. I just turned that till it pointed at number 1 with the engine on the mark. Uh-oh, Pete said. Where? Under the distributor cap. Under the cap, Les said. No way, you don't touch that. No? Uh-uh. That times your cap to your rotor. You never touch it. If the timing's way off, you gotta take the governor housing off to get to the gears. Otherwise, it's just like a car. Just turn the distributor a little. All you did, you messed up the timing between your cap and rotor. Did seem even worse after. Pete chuckled. Oh yeah, it'll never run with that messed up. There's marks on each gear to get it back right. I'll come by this weekend. Wasn't there something else wrong with that? Well, it's got water in the oil. That was it, Les said. Tried to put antifreeze in it once. Turned the crankcase oil to soup. Forget your spark problem, Pete said. What you got there is a piece of junk with a cracked block. Some punk gives an old man $50 for it, fixes the body up, waiting for a sucker to come along, and there you come. Shelled out good money for a piece of junk. Think you're gonna spray a young orchard with it? Junk it. Put your money in a good little 3-point hitch rig. If you're lucky, it might just be the head gasket, Les said. And if not, we can still swap the engine in under a day. Where can I find an engine? They're around. Yeah, but how many that ain't junk like his, Pete said. What do you got when you're all done? A rig like that still can't do what you'd want it to. Tow behind attachments. Need 2 men just to spray. What are you going to do when you get a heavy rain overnight in May and you got to be out by 5, spraying for scab? Who are you going to find to help you spray that early? Hervey shrugged. I'll find somebody. Les finished sharpening the saw and went outside with it again, carrying a tiny screwdriver. This time they heard it start after a few pulls and come to a smooth idle. Then the idle came up in pitch, indicating a small increase in engine speed. Then it went to full throttle, and then up and up a little higher, then back to low idle again. Finally they heard the saw go from low idle to full throttle a number of times, until there was no hesitation between the two. Then the saw fell silent. Hervey and Pete stared without much interest at the sitcom on the TV. With the saw no longer running, they became aware of the wind gusts against the windows once again. If those jokers run into trouble, they can find somebody else to bail them out, Hervey said. I can't imagine they'll do anything foolish on a night like this. I wouldn't count on it. As far as that goes, I don't see why you put up with half of it as it is. I don't put up with nothing, Hervey protested. He took a drag and flicked his ashes onto his plate. Like what? Take prices. No reason the men even need to know prices till payday. You blab about it first thing, let them bawl about it like it's a topic for presidential debate. Can't see keeping it a secret. Oh, I can see talking it over with one man so you get it right. Say Les here. Pete tilted his head towards the empty seat in front of him while still staring at the TV, his arms folded on his chest. Then the rest of them will... And you take these guys that show up one week, miss the next, show up the week after. Pete shook his head. That's just irresponsible. I can't very well dump a guy because he's got to see his probation officer. Well, they got to learn sometime. You tried keeping... Oh, I know. Can't keep the men. Growers all want their place done yesterday. I've been there. But I still say you're better off with 5 or 6 dependable guys than a loose pack of 8 or 10. Too sloppy. This feels about right to me. Covering ground, money's been steady. Outside the trailer, they heard Les greet someone. A minute later, the door opened, and a tall, solid-looking man with a crew cut and square-framed glasses entered deliberately, followed by Les. Every movement of the older man radiated strength. Dave turned towards them from the sink. It's the Admiral. On your feet, men. At ease, the man said, laughing easily, the long creases in his cheeks becoming more pronounced. Hervey and Pete greeted the old grower in unison, and Hervey motioned towards the chair at the opposite end of his table, next to the storage cabinet. Coffee, Phil? Hervey asked. Why not? Smells like supper was almost edible, Phil said as he took his seat. Nobody died yet, Pete said, chuckling. There's some left over, Dave offered, placing a mug of coffee and a jug of milk down in front of him. No thanks, just 8. Helen would have my head. Helen? Hervey asked. My son's wife. I ate with them now. I came up to settle with your tree surgeon. Who? Pete asked. Benny, Hervey said. Hid that maple outside Phil's house. He turned to Phil. He stepped out for a while. Taking him to the morgue, Pete added. Guess I won't have to worry about his bill then, Phil said. He draped one arm over the back of his chair and rested the other on the table, his thick, calloused fingers wrapped around the coffee mug. A grease stain near the frayed elbow of his coat left a smudge along the table edge. As far as that goes, Hervey said, remind me to knock whatever he charges you off my bill. You don't have to do that. I want to. See, Benny thinks every little job's supposed to put him on Easy Street. He flicked his ashes. He's a little thin on top. Did a good job on that maple. Oh, he's a good tree man. No argument there. You'd be hard-pressed to find better. That's the only reason Hervey keeps him around, Pete added. Phil took a sip of his coffee. Wow, that's rugged, he said. He poured in some more milk, then handed the jug to Dave. Benny wouldn't do too bad if he ever learned to hold on to his money, Pete said. Long as I've known him, he never could hold on to a dime. He scratched his beard. That's what being a whoremaster will do for you. Yeah, well, that's all changed now, Hervey said, laughing and coughing. Now that he's married himself the genuine item. The other crew members smiled. What's that supposed to mean? Pete waved a hand in front of his face as though swatting away an insect. You don't want to know, he said. Okay, Phil said, taking another sip. See, Benny's old lady, Pete began. She's a whore, to put it plain, from New Orleans. Met her while he was down there cleaning up after a hurricane. Now you might think that old Benny would at least kindly ask her to retire once they got married. He waved a hand in midair. No, sir. Seems he likes the extra money. One time Benny drives in Friday evening after being away from home working all week, and the little missus is still hard at work. Servicing a disabled serviceman, you might say. He chuckled at his pun. Man that drove him's in the kitchen, helping himself to a sandwich. Old Benny gets all fired up. After they leave, he says, "Honey," he says, "I don't mind you making a few bucks while I'm away, but once I come home, that's it. And another thing," he says, "tell them to bring their own sandwich and stay away from the refrigerator." "You're making that up," Phil said. "He told us that himself, didn't he?" Herbie said, turning to Les. "He said it," Les confirmed. "Yes, sir, Benny really laid down the law that time," Pete added. "I don't believe it," Phil said, shaking his head. "At first I thought he was lying," Herbie said. "Then I thought, why would somebody make something like that up and then tell it to somebody else?" Phil shook his head again as he looked down at his cup, and his smile faded. They were all quiet for a minute. Les was filing the teeth on his own saw. He finished one side and turned the saw around to file the other side. They could barely hear the TV, a man's voice shouting and then gunshots. Dave rinsed the last plate, wiped down the stove, and began to retreat to his bunk. Seeing Herbie's plate filled with ashes and butts, he replaced it with an ashtray, rinsed and washed the plate. He went back to his bunk and sat down. Rather than lying down, he merely unlaced his boots and remained sitting on the edge, listening in. The hardest gust to that point shook the trailer. The windows whistled, and the whole trailer shook on its springs. "We're in for it," Phil said. "They're saying it's supposed to move through in a hurry. Start to clear out by the end of the day," Herbie said. "That's what I heard," Phil said. "You won't be working tomorrow," he added, half questioning. "I don't imagine anybody will want to," Herbie said. He coughed so violently that he winced and then cleared his throat. "Not that I... No, they'll wait it out. Besides, 4 good hours on Friday, we should be just about done. We're down in the hollow on the west side as it is. You mind us leaving the trailer back here a few more weeks? See, I promised another grower up near home we'd do his place next. Probably take 2 weeks, maybe into a third. And we got 2 little jobs to finish up down here. As long as you don't mind finishing up the south block." "Shouldn't be a problem. Might get to it Friday. Why, what happened to the other guy?" "Quit. Don't ask me. He came looking for me late this morning. Gave me his bill. Said he had to get to another job. He left 7 or 8 full rows over there. I thought you fellas might know what the problem was." "Never said nothing to me," Herbie said. "Les ain't saying nothing," Pete said, chuckling. Les smiled a little, but continued to look down at his saw. Phil waited patiently for an explanation. "Had a little contest yesterday, most trees in a day. This boy," Pete nodded towards Les, "kinda got the better of him. Worked right through the night. Whipped him by what? About a half a dozen. Finished his trees, too. Must have hurt the boy's pride." "Good riddance," Phil said after a pause. He took another sip of coffee. "Who else you doing down here?" "One's Watson, you know him, I guess," Herbie said, and Phil nodded. "Another's a guy over in Highland, little place, about 10 acres of standards, right on top of the ridge. See for miles from up there." "That's orchard country," Phil said. "No, suit yourself. Stay here while you're doing those places if you want. Just pay for an oil fill-up for the quarters when you're all done." Herbie nodded as he lit another cigarette. The man who had been lying on his bunk with the radio sat up with the most recent wind gust. He walked up the aisle, smiling rather sheepishly. "Egad, it's Frankenstein," Phil said. "Hello, Pee-wee." The man giggled in his deep voice. He poked around in the refrigerator until he found the plate of pork chops. then clawed a hole through the plastic wrap and removed one. He stood leaning against the refrigerator as he began to nibble his way through it. Phil watched him for a minute, then turned towards the back. "Just a growing boy. Won't you feed him enough?" "You'd have to run a pipeline to his stomach all day to keep him happy," Herbie said. "Ain't that right, Fred?" "Ha! I don't generally eat all that much to speak of, unless I was meaning to ask," Phil said. "Did that man who talked to Billy ever stop by?" "The other tree guy?" Herbie asked. Phil nodded. "This morning." Herbie took a drag. "Didn't work out." He paused again. "He uses a different system." "Oh," Phil said. "Too bad. I imagine it would be hard to work in a new man on the spur of the moment." "Depends who it is," Herbie said. "See, as a rule, your crew can live with a guy that don't really know what he's doing," Pete said. "I've run a good many crews." Dave yawned loudly and the others laughed. "That'll be enough out of you," Pete said, chuckling. "I've run many crews and trained many men. Now let's say you got a new guy. Well, he's stinking things up a bit, but mostly he's leaving too much in the tree. Afraid he's going to break something. Well, out of 7 or 8 guys, ain't no big deal if one's leaving too much. Now the guy that thinks he knows what he's doing but don't, that's another story. Always looking for shortcuts. You got a couple of butchers on a crew, you got problems." He worked on an itchy spot under his chin and stared at a point on the floor near Phil's feet. "Not that this crew's got anybody like that." "I was going to say," Phil said. Pete glanced at Herbie, who looked rather annoyed, and then back at Phil. "No, actually, this is a real good crew," Pete said. "Sure, now that you give him the idea we're a bunch of tree butchers." Herbie shook his head, a disgusted look on his face. "Actually, this is the best damn crew I ever laid eyes on. There, that good enough?" Herbie nodded reluctantly. "All right, then." Pete looked back at Phil. "What you want to do is work a man in slow. When I train somebody, I spend a few days working with him pretty close. Help him pick out his cuts and so forth. After that, you give him some advice now and then, but pretty much they gotta pick it up as they go along." "That's it. They gotta learn as they go," Herbie said. Fred had remained leaning against the refrigerator after finishing his pork chop. "Learn as they go," he said, nodding. The others looked at him for a moment. "Of course, you take that too far," Pete said to Herbie, then turned back to Phil. "Just hands him a saw, points to a tree, and says, 'Go.'" "That's not true. That ain't true," Herbie said. "Sure, I spent some time with a new guy. But what's the sense holding his hand? Either he's going to stick with it or he ain't. If he's going to stick with it, you can't keep him from learning. And if he ain't, you either wasted your time or trained yourself a competitor. Really, you learn by keeping your eye on the veterans," Pete said. "Like the old craft guilds," Les added. He checked the chain one last time, spinning it around slowly, then set the saw under the table. He crumpled up the dirty sheets of newspaper and carried them up to the trash. "Excuse me, Fred," he said as he passed the much larger man. "Different, too, in many ways," he said, coming back to his seat. "You don't have distinct tasks and levels of training based on—" "I've had it happen too many times," Herbie said. "Just get somebody trained to the point where it pays to have him around, and then—" He whistled and sent one arm floating away. "Off he goes, usually with a buddy or two. Then I gotta scramble, maybe for the rest of the season. Scramble to finish jobs, find new men. Then when I got enough workers again, I lose some of the work to the guys that quit." He shook his head and gestured with the cigarette. "Not that I blame the growers. Grower thinks he's getting a better deal. Guys show up, offer him a lower price than me. You don't know quite when or if I'll get there. Only kicks himself later, after they got drunk a few times or walked off altogether. By then, maybe I'm all booked up." "I've never known you to turn down a job," Pete said. "Sure I have. Oh, I'll line him up for the next winter. Most places don't want you working trees heavy at blossom time anyway." He paused and took a long drag. I try to tell these guys, price is going to go up and down a little one job to the next. It averages out. You take half your growers. You're so close to the edge as it is, you can't quite charge what you want. Got to walk a fine line. And others are lawyers or doctors or stockbrokers. Couldn't care less if they make a profit on the farm or not. Matter of fact, they'd just as soon take a loss, write it off. Them are your gravy jobs. But you try telling some of these guys that. He waved his cigarette and shook his head. No, it's if we get a certain price for one job, ought to get the same on every job. Winds up hurting the real growers, because of course I got to try to get all my prices up there. Matter of fact, your gravy jobs don't really help the men either in the long run. He paused, waiting for encouragement, then continued anyway. Take a guy like Benny. Once he knows a price, if it ain't just what he thinks it ought to be, that's all he can think about. Slows him right down. Starts yammering with somebody else. Pretty soon he might quit altogether. Then 2 months later, he's flat broke, back on hands and knees. Didn't gain a bit by any of it. Crushed his cigarette into the ashtray, which was already looking occupied. Sometimes a whole crew will walk. Like almost happened last winter, Pete put in, grinning. Oh? Phil asked. Not really, Herbie said. I kind of blew a price. Kind of, Dave said. Kinda? Ha! More like, Fred said. Well, it weren't just the price, Herbie said. Big place up the valley. Kind of a misery job anyway. Place hadn't been done in about 5 years. I didn't really want to take it, but at the time we were short of work. I admit I blew the price. Gave the guy a price before we'd worked all that much. Pretty quick I realized I was about $2 a tree too low. By that time, what could I do? I already given my word. Could have changed your word, Dave suggested. Well, I don't do that. He took a long drag. Of course, that weren't all of it. Can never be just one thing. We started up there in early December, about when we got that heavy rain that turned to snow, and then the cold snap. Phil nodded. Didn't get too much snow down here. Well, they got it there. Got about 18 inches on top of the ice. Big limbs had snow and ice the whole time. Had to use ladders a lot of places. Had about 3 weeks straight, it seemed like the temperature didn't get above 0 all day. He took another drag and then laughed. I might have walked myself if I wasn't boss man. These guys right here kept it together, Pete said. Herbie studied him momentarily. How do you mean? You think them other jokers would have stuck with it if you didn't have a few guys just went out and did their job every day? How do you know? You weren't with us. Didn't have to be. I've heard enough talk. Isn't that a little early to go out and prune heavy that far north? Phil put in. Tell him, Phil, Pete said. Well, that's another story. Anyway, that's how it went. 5 miserable weeks. Seemed like 5 months. Years. He turned towards the window. I'm about ready to give it up, to tell you the truth. Another few years, won't be no real need for a crew like this one. What with half your growers selling out, the other half going to smaller trees. Not that that's a bad thing, just the way it is. Let's face it, Phil said. There's only so many guys who'll do this kind of work these days. Then you've got your comp and your government regs to contend with. Oh, tell me about it, Hervey said. Sure, there's some hazard involved. Working 20 feet up in trees, half a mile from nowhere, half the time in freezing weather, with chainsaws. He laughed at the picture he was painting. Sure, it's a smidge hazardous, so I can see why insurance is high. He lit another cigarette. Like they say, don't try this at home, Pete quipped. And I don't want no medal, Hervey continued. Just 'cause I provide a few jobs, I don't want no medal. But the truth is, I'm doing the government a favor. He waited a few seconds, but no one said anything. Want to know why? He asked loudly, staring at Pete. Why? Pete asked dutifully, exaggeratedly. Thank you. Lots of guys worked for me over the years. They've been in all kinds of trouble. You name it, they put guys away for it. Well, I ain't never had no mass murderers or anything like that. Well, we ain't exactly altar boys, Pete said. Did I say anything? Hervey snapped. He turned back to Phil. Now, once a guy's been in and out of jail a few times, who's going to hire him? Sure, some places will, but not many. One way or another, a guy's going to get his hands on money, and if it ain't one way, it's going to be the other. Then they got to lock him up. What's that cost the taxpayer? Well, that's one way to look at it, Pete said. What's another? That they can still raise all the hell they want on weekends, especially with a pocket full of Grants and Andy Jacksons. Well, I still say a guy's 10 times more likely to stay out of trouble if he's working steady. And suppose he's on probation really trying to get his act together. I ain't gonna can a guy just 'cause he's gotta miss a week now and then. Pete said, nibbling on a beard hair. You're right. You ain't gonna get no medal, so don't hold your breath. Suppose somebody done something rotten once upon a time, Hervey said, pointing his cigarette at the huge man standing in the aisle. Maybe they should have fried him, but they didn't. Now they let him out. So what's he supposed to do? Crawl under a rock? Go off and live in a cave? I haven't had any trouble to speak of. Not since... But I swear it's somebody's job to make my life miserable. Every time I turn around, I'm getting fined for this or audited for that. Insurance goes up every year. He paused and took a drag. Sure, it's hazardous. What isn't? I'll bet it's safer than commuting to the city. Worst thing usually happens is white knuckle from gripping a saw out in the cold day after day. Poor circulation. Then some guys kind of use themselves up after 20 years or so. Again he waved his cigarette towards Fred. But that's just a matter of using your head and taking care of yourself. I've been in this 20 years myself. I ain't never seen a fatal accident. No, not fatal, Fred said. Seen plenty of spills, Pete said. Worst thing I ever seen was when Everett cut himself in the forehead, Hervey said, looking at Pete, and then turning back to Phil. Which weren't no big deal as it turned out. Everett ran crews. Everett, Dwight. He checked to see if Phil recognized the name. Awful good man. Give you the shirt off his back. Anyway, one day his saw kicked. Come back right in his face. He just walks up to me, just as calm as if he was going to bum a smoke. Want to take me to the hospital, he says. Just like that. Covered with blood. I nearly fainted. A few days later, he's back out working like nothing ever happened. He's a fine man, Pete added. I think he stopped by and talked to me once a long time ago, Phil said. I did all my own pruning back then. That was the fun job. I loved working all alone in the orchard, even in a snowstorm. That's the nicest time, Pete said, especially if there's a little breeze so it ain't building up on the limbs. You felt like you were all alone in the world. It's fine work, no mistake, Pete said. Tell people that, they'll think you're foolish. But there's something about it, like it gets into your blood or something. I always enjoyed. I hope I breathe my last breath working a tree, Les said. The others stared at him momentarily. He had his left arm on the table, his hand under his chin, turned towards the TV, the same position he'd been in since finishing with his saw. Funny thing, Hervey said. I've probably had 100 guys, more than that, work for me over the years. Everything from a guy with a PhD who was dropping out of society to guys who dropped out of 6th grade, never quite made it into society. He laughed and cleared his throat. And you just can't tell who's going to take to the work. Take this one guy, college grad. Worked for me for 2 whole seasons and never learned what the hell he was doing. Remember him? Hervey turned to Pete. Pete nodded. Pathetic, he said, chuckling. Men all called him Top Quark. He chuckled some more. Don't know why, though. Other guys, Hervey continued. Well, take Benny, for instance. You'd swear he had no more brains in his head than a pigeon, but... No, it ain't strictly brains, Pete said. Not to change the subject, Phil said, but it seems to me I've seen you somewhere. I mean, before these last 2 weeks. You mean you two ain't been properly introduced? Hervey said, slapping himself playfully on the forehead. Where's my manners? This is Pete DeWitt. Only he'd prefer you call him by his real name, Isidore. Pete shot a fierce glance across the aisle, and Herbie laughed. He's got a farm of his own, Herbie continued. Just tags along with us a couple weeks now and then, for fun. Something different, Pete said, still pouting. Maybe I've seen you at a growers' meeting. Possibly, Pete said. Or on his moonlighting job as one of Santa's helpers, Dave suggested. Comical. Oh, ain't we all just comical tonight, Pete said, his cheeks becoming even rosier. He smiled finally. Yes, we might have met at a growers' meeting. Very possibly. He examined another long beard hair that had come loose with all the grooming. I am a grower, but for how long? That's the question. He grinned and looked towards Herbie. Bank owns him, Herbie explained. It ain't really that bad, Pete said. Not that bad. If you miss one crop, just one crop in the next... Don't remind me. No, at least I've got the land, and property values have gone way up since I bought the place. Just one hailstorm in August or September. Got about 80 acres in trees total, Pete said, ignoring Herbie. Still standards mostly. One block's interplanted with 106s, about like up there. He tilted his head towards the hill. Put in a few acres of vegetables every year, too, mostly squash and pumpkins. My son, Billy, puts in about 20 acres of vegetables, Phil said. Ain't nothing serious with me. Just something else for the store. My deal's the orchard. Last year I started pushing out the standards and replanting. Got to if I'm going to compete. Going to put in a little 10-acre block of dwarves, M7 rootstocks with M9 interstems on trellises. Posts with 3 wires. 2-dimensional trees, Pete said, chuckling again. The interstem's supposed to dwarf them right down. Hope it works better than the 106s. Anyway, over 200 trees an acre. Ought to produce 1,000 bushels an acre in 6 years. I'll believe that when I see it. Gonna cost enough to put in, I know that. Something over 20 grand. I can't see why you're going ahead with that so soon, Herbie said. Can't, huh? What's to wait for? Sooner the trees go in, the sooner the crop comes in. Bottom line, my friend. I didn't get to this point by waiting for the planets to converge. Early bird catches the worm. Don't put off till tomorrow what you can do today. Opportunity knocks but once. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched, Dave chimed in. Huh. Quite the comedian. Everybody's going to the smaller trees, Phil said. He stared down at his empty coffee mug. Can I fill that for you? Herbie asked. No thanks. I just don't know. What, about the coffee? Pete quipped, grinning. Billy and I have been going at it over the hill block for the past 5 years. He says if it's there, it's just a temptation for me to spend time and money on it. I say, what's the rush to push it out? At least we know what we've got. It's like Old Faithful. It produces every year. The young block across the road gets frosted out every 3rd year, and the newest block isn't even bearing yet. He tapped one hand on the table idly a few times. Seems to me if you tried to follow the market, you'd be replanting every year. 20 years ago, everybody put in Red Delicious. Now they're coming back out again. Now it's Empires, Paula Reds, and the Redder Max. Maybe in 5 years the market will come back to Spies and Baldwins, Black Twigs and Goldens, and the original Max, and I'll be in good shape. You're ahead of the times, Herbie said. That's the first time I've been accused of that. Really, you might say you're in a unique position here, Pete said. First off, you own the place outright, am I right? Ain't one grower in 10 can say that. Second, you market everything right here. None of that happened by accident. I had plenty of chances to pick up more land, especially just before and during the war. I guess I blew it. Back then, land prices were rock bottom, and crop prices were high. I suppose I'd be in clover by now. But what did I want with more land? What we had here was always enough. Don't get me wrong, Pete said. I ain't knocking what you got here. and I wish I could run my place the same way. Oh, I got a farm store, do some pick your own, run some promo stunts and the like. All of that helps, but we got an awful lot of competition for the same customers. Ain't like down here where you're one of the last growers and you got about a zillion people living nearby. Up north, everybody and his uncle's putting in a block of trees. All got the same idea. Have an easy little business near home, work outside, meet people. Back to the land, fine with me. It's their land. They'll find out it ain't so easy. Just means I'll always have to sell most of my crop through a distributor. So I better have what the supermarkets want, or else. Or else I can eat lots of pie all winter. He paused and stared at his reflection in the window. Seems to me the public wants to have their pie and eat it too. I'd like to see little old-fashioned farms like this place hang around, but... He paused again to gather his thoughts. Take chemicals. Can't have no scab spots or bug stings on the fruit, but don't want us using no chemicals either. Well, you can't have it both ways. Takes an awful lot of spray to get those pretty red fruit they like to buy. Well, but you can't listen to the salesman for the chemical companies, Phil said. They'd have you out there every other day with the spray rig. You gotta watch the trees. And the weather, of course. He rubbed the corner of his eye and adjusted his glasses. Herculeo's the tough one. We get a lot of that, especially near the woods towards the west where you're working now. And scab, of course. Most years I get by with 8 or 9 sprayings, depending on the spring. They tell me that's low. I'd like to cut it down more. That is low, Pete confirmed. Ain't unusual to use twice that many. But it's like you say, your customers know what you got here, and if they don't like it, they can pretty well lump it. Me, I've got no room for error. It's not like I'm selling garbage, Phil said with a little laugh. No, I wasn't saying that, Pete said, chuckling. You and me both know most sting marks don't mean there's a bug inside. Just a way for a piece of fruit to heal itself after a bug takes a nip or hatches out and flies the coop. Don't change the flavor either. Same with a little scab spot. Okay, it don't store quite so good. Or take the color of a mac. The old one's fruit was hardly ever more than half red before it was ready to drop. But you never tasted a better apple. Now I can't sell a mac if it ain't 3/4 red or more, so I got to spray to keep them on the tree longer. Or cut down the old trees. And what happens when one of these chemicals gets pulled? Papers make it out like we've been trying to poison people. Scapegoats, that's what we are. He scratched his beard in reflection. This whole business about chemicals is blown way out of proportion. Lots of these chemicals they've been pulling, weren't nothing wrong with them in the first place. I don't know about that, Phil said. Better let him finish, Phil, Herbie said. Otherwise the rest of us will have to hear it for the rest of the week. Well, there wasn't. I remember back 20 years or so ago. We'd get through spraying DDT and come in with our tanks not quite empty. What were we going to do with it? Why, we'd get into spray fights. Hose each other down good. Pete chuckled at the memory. Have an awful good time. Phil seemed to be studying the corner of the table with a look, half puzzled, half amused. The others exchanged glances. Herbie finally burst out laughing. Didn't Pete used to be 4 inches taller? Dave asked, no one in particular. His beard didn't used to be curly either, Les added. Comical. Oh, ain't we all just the height of comedy, Pete said loudly, chuckling at last. They were quiet, and again became conscious of the wind, now steady and stiff. Phil looked down at the table, and a look of profound sadness came over his features. My wife, Elizabeth, just died about 8 months ago. Lymph node cancer. I'd hate to think something I used here had anything to do with it. He said the last words very quietly. The others looked at him momentarily and then looked away. The refrigerator seemed to have added a new rattling noise. An excited voice on the TV urged them to take a vacation in the Caribbean. Herbie stood up and walked over to the man at the other end of the table. "Let me refill that for you," he said. "Sure," Phil said, taking the steaming mug. "Actually, you might say we're all of us fighting a losing battle," Pete said. "Let's face it, whether we got 40 acres or 400, orchard, dairy, vegetables, whatever, we're rinky-dink operations compared to other places. In the long run, we lose. Except the dopers," Phil said. "They do all right." There was a long pause after this unexpected turn. "I had a couple of boys come up to me once. 'Let us put our plants on your land. We'll cut you in on the profits.' I said, 'Sure, you bring your plants right over. But just be sure you're ready to meet God when you do, because I'm going to blow both your heads off if I ever see you around here again.'" He'd resumed his previous confident expression and tone. "Probably moved over to your neighbor's land," Les said. "Probably," Phil said. Pete said. "Ain't no way you can stop it. Just end up getting yourself killed." "Well," Phil said, "we all gotta die sometime." "Well, anyway," Pete said, "to get back to what I was saying. I say we're lucky to have the real estate market so good, or when the farming craps out altogether. You'd have a heart attack if I told you what I've been offered for this place." "Grab it, man. Grab it and run with it." "I've never run from anything," Phil said. Again his words were followed by a long pause. "Besides, this place is all I've ever known." He picked at the chipped corner of his coffee mug. "I suppose I'm just not very ambitious." He took a sip of coffee and made a face. "God, that's awful." "No, I'm just a farmer. Just an apple farmer." He looked out the window. "Guess I just wasn't very ambitious." "Of course I understand how you feel about the place," Pete said. "Probably been in the family 200 years. Probably kissed your first girl sitting by the pond. Now you got grandkids coming along. Lots of sentimental value. But look at it this way. That hill block went in, 60, 70 years ago?" "After World War I, Phil said. Before that, the place was probably a dairy." "All right, before it was a dairy, they probably had a little bit of everything. And 100 years before that, the Indians was up there hunting woodchucks. Nobody got all choked up when any of them changes happened. So if the next crop's got to be houses, well, that's just how it is. Nothing to get sentimental about." He looked out the window momentarily, then unfolded his arms as he began again. "At least that's how I gotta look at it. I ain't saying I'd sell my place tomorrow, but I ain't saying I wouldn't either if I got the right offer. Might try to find a way to have it both ways. Sell parts of it and keep the core." Chuckled at his pun. "But basically, I run a business. The bottom line, well, the bottom line's the bottom line. Gotta keep your options open." "That ain't what you told me," Herbie said. "What?" Pete demanded. Herbie turned to Phil. "Told me they'd have to use dynamite to get him off his place. Said he'd..." "Oh, this save the farm foolishness," Pete cut in quickly. "I find the whole thing irksome. What it is just rich suburban types want to look at pretty farm scenery on the drive out to their country place. Got nothing to do with farm output. Our production don't amount to beans compared to other parts of the country. And it don't have to do with protecting farmland either. What's our bony little hills and valleys compared to the Midwest, California? Worthless. That's why everybody took off for them other places in the first place." "There's good land up here," Phil said. "Yeah, but there's better land somewhere else. That's my point. There's so much land in this country, the government pays people not to plant on half of it." Well, I couldn't really say anybody needs this scrap of land for their food. They like to come here, though. I know that. They can wear any old clothes, joke around, take their time. They run into people they haven't seen in years. You should hear all the different languages. Polish, Italian, German. Lately, Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese. Like a mini UN, some kind of center for the area. After a minute, Phil turned in his chair. Well, I guess I'll shove off. He took one last swallow of coffee and started to stand. Nobody needs that chair, Herbie said. Yeah, seems good to have a respectable human being around for once, Pete said, chuckling. I admit it is interesting chatting with you men, Phil said, smiling a little. Sure, Herbie said. Phil sat just on the edge of his chair and put his hands in his pockets. They were quiet again, listening to the wind. He stared out the window and saw the silhouettes of the swaying Cortland trees in front of the light from the pickers' quarters. He straightened the glasses on the bridge of his nose. We had our share of tough times over the years, but it's been a good life. His voice was quiet. They say the Depression years were tough, but at least then people seemed to give a damn about each other. He laughed. I don't know. I guess I've just lived too long. He looked down at his watch and stood up. Well, gentlemen, he said more loudly, I always like to tease the grandkids before they get caged in for the night. Tell your tree surgeon he did a good job on that maple. Oh, we'll tell him, Herbie said. In no uncertain terms, Pete said. Say, that wasn't true about... Phil paused and shook his head. Well, you'll have the bill ready for me? Friday morning, Herbie said. I should be around. Have Smitty track me down if you can't find me. Excuse me, Pee-wee, he said as he walked past Fred. The others spoke their farewells and watched him go out. Les picked his saw up from under the table, brought it out to the van, and came back inside. He picked up his toolbox and went back to his bunk. Dave and Fred were already lying on their bunks. Fred had his little headphones on and his arm over his eyes as earlier, already starting to snore. Les slipped the toolbox under Fred's bunk, and in a minute it climbed up into his own, and as soon as he was in his sleeping bag, he felt himself pleasantly drifting off. He was startled awake by voices and laughter outside. The door opened and Stu came in carrying a bag of groceries. He sat down in the seat nearest the TV set and put the bag of groceries on the table in front of him. Here you go, he shouted towards Dave, who had also nearly fallen asleep. We get lost? Pete asked. Only a little, Stu said. He smiled like the cat that ate the canary. Rather than say what was on his mind, he bit his lip and ducked his head. He looked up quickly with a fierce, predatory expression. Say, Les, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. We met some good buddies of yours while we were out. Les propped himself up on one elbow. Met them at the grocery store. Who's that? Good friends, Les, good friends. Remember the boys you hired and then fired when you went out on your own last April? You remember. Dick and Jane, or whatever their names were. Fired them after about 2 weeks. Sure you do. Stu watched with satisfaction as Les's expression lost its calm, became somewhat puzzled, irritated. What do you know? It seems they're working down near here, too. Isn't that a nice coincidence? Maybe you all can get reacquainted. I think they'd like that. He laughed raucously, sarcastically. They were surprised to hear you were back with the crew. Got their little wheels spinning, feeling sorry for themselves, feeling betrayed. Now it seems they don't like you too well, Les. Don't like you too well at all. Said some things that truly shocked my ears. But I do get the feeling they'd like to get reacquainted sometime soon. Where are they working? Herbie asked. Stu was reluctant to take his eyes off his quarry. He turned to Herbie finally. Watson. We got Watson. You mean you had Watson, Stu said. He turned back to Les, decided he had said enough, and addressed them all loudly. "Well, Mr. Sandman's calling, and we've got a big day tomorrow," he said with exaggerated cheerfulness. "Night, boys and girls." Benny climbed the stairs just after Stu left, still holding the handkerchief to his left eye, scowling. He turned on the faucet and soaked and wrung out the handkerchief. Very slowly he walked back to his bunk, and just as slowly began unbuttoning his shirt, leaving an alcohol reek in his wake. Dave started to get up. "I'll get it," Les said. He jumped down and slipped his pants and boots back on, then quickly distributed the items in their cabinet and the refrigerator, folded the empty paper bag, and placed it with a few others beside the cabinet. He started to walk back to his bunk, but merely picked his coat up and put it on, then walked back up the aisle and went out. Chapter 3. In the Storm. Even with his coat on, the wind cut right through. Les started to shiver. He went down to the parking lot. Only the nightlight was on at Phil's. He hoped that meant the old grower was still down at his son's house. The streetlight at the corner near the sales barn shook as it illuminated the lot, casting dim waves of yellow-gray light. Something was being carried on the wind, not snow or ice crystals, some kind of dust or fine sand. Betrayed, he thought. Betrayed. Idiots. What had these idiots put into those idiots' heads? The possibilities were limitless. He had, in fact, hired 2 men and then fired them in short order the previous spring. No mystery or intrigue about it. They couldn't or wouldn't adjust to the way the grower had required the job done. Their constant whining tipped the scales. He had finished the job alone. Now this. Could have made it all up. Not likely. He had to find out, though. He turned away from the parking lot and back towards the trailer. The wind funneled around the storage building, so that he had to turn away to catch his breath. Through the picture window of the picker's quarters, he saw the shadows of 2 of the men seated around a small table, projected onto the ceiling. He stood outside for a minute and watched their slight movements, hearing the music from their radio, listening to the wind in the trees all around him. He stopped his teeth from chattering, then climbed the few concrete steps and opened the door. "Les," Tom said. "Lester Mal," Stu said. "Close it quick, Les. The cold's coming in." Stu lay on his bunk with a car magazine, only glancing up briefly. Gibby and Tom sat around the small table in the aisle. Les sat down on the bunk nearest them. 15-2, 15-4, pair 6, pair 8, Gibby said, laying down his cards and pegging his points. "Hey, Les, there'll be the usual charge for the facilities." His face remained fixed in a smirk. "You done?" Tom asked. "I don't know. Let me see." Gibby studied his cards again. "Yeah." "Okay, sport. I'll take your point for the jack." "You would, you miserable cur." "Plus 8 in my hand and 4 in the crib makes 13 altogether." "Not polite to brag," Gibby said. He picked up a nearly full 1/5 of whiskey from near his feet and took a swig. "What are you doing with that here?" Les said sharply. "Strictly medicinal, Les, good buddy. Strictly medicinal. Poor Tom here's got a toothache." He roared with laughter at his own joke. "Care for a nip?" "No, thanks. You know you can't have that here." Stu pointed out the metal frame window behind him. "With that blowing around? You're not going to care. Besides, who's going to say anything?" Les leaned back on the uncovered mattress with both elbows and stared at the card game. Double run of 4 makes 10, 15, 12, 14, 16, Tom said. Looks to be my game, sport. Don't be too sure there, Jasper. 15, 2, and a run of 3 makes 5. Now, let's have a gander at the crib. Nothing. There now, that's more like it. Tom scooped up the cards and began to shuffle. I had to laugh, Gibby said, already twittering. Remember Benny says to me after I took that spill up in Plymouth, he says, if I ever took a spill like that, I'd never climb another tree as long as I live. Remember? Yeah, Stu said. Well, all I could think about today while we're doing that maple, if he takes a spill from the top of that rascal and lands on his head on the blacktop, he'll never climb another tree as long as he lives. Stu said. Tom said. Ch! Les snorted. A minute later, Stu looked up again from his magazine, giggling hysterically. Les, we stopped at this little dive Benny knew about. He started to giggle so uncontrollably he couldn't continue. Tell him, he said to Gibby. Went to this topless bar. Sat at a table in the corner. Girl comes over to us. Takes one look at Tom. Sits down on his lap. Says, you're so ugly you make me horny. They fell apart. Yep, Tom said, beaming his toothless smile. You should have seen him, Gibby said, twittering. He was proud as a peacock. Looks like somebody just gave him a promotion, Stu said. Les leaned back farther. Gibby, Tom, and Stu each took another swig. Suppose you might put your cards in the crib before daybreak? Tom asked. Kids these days. Comes from all this permissiveness, that's what I say. Say, Lester, you find a boyfriend for your old lady this winter? Or you make her rummage around for one herself? What is she, helpless? I just thought you might do the gentlemanly thing. She's not the good-hearted sort, Stu said. Apparently. Speaking of which, Tom said to Gibby, is it true I'm to start calling you Daddy? Whoa, worth the day, not to start believing ugly rumors there, Junior. Rumors, nothing. I saw them leave Ned's arm in arm Saturday night, Stu said. Going straight for your mom's place, at a trot. Rumors, lies, abomination, vile spawn of the devil. It was more like a canter. Okay, Daddy, you start. Oh, Gibby studied his cards. 1, he said. 11. 21 for 2. Ha! 31 for a 6, 8. That's the ball game. Here, I'll gather the cards for you, Dad. Good boy. For a minute there was only the sound of cards being shuffled and dealt and the music from the little radio. You didn't really see those other guys, Les asked finally. Other guys. Now let me see, Gibby said. Now to whom might he be referring? Sure did, Tom said. Same place Tom met his true love, Stu added. He watched with satisfaction as the scowl came over Les's features, then reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Here's that bill you won. He waved the 50 from his outstretched hand. Keep it. You won it fair and square, Stu protested sarcastically. Vanquished the monstrous machine, a latter-day John Henry, our hero, Gibby said, twittering. 6, Tom said. Let me see. 14. 21 for 3. 26 for 4. Top that. 31 for 4. Picking up right where I left off. What did they say? Nothing you'd care to hear, Les, good buddy, Gibby said. Pretty gruesome stuff, Tom said. But don't worry, we stood up for you. Told them you said you could take all 3 of them, and the sooner the better, Stu said. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, they had a 3rd guy with them. Big as Stewie, Tom said. Not quite, Stu said. Told them you said you were going to bite off their heads. And spit in their necks, Tom added. I never said a thing about those guys. Now, don't be modest, Gibby said. Any man who could work for 20 hours straight and whip a machine 10 times his size could surely dispense with 3 mere mortals. Simple arithmetic. Besides, we was just interpreting your silence on the matter, Tom said. So I suggest you start sharpening your teeth. You didn't tell them we were here. Pfft, of course we did, Stu said. Drew them a map. You didn't expect us to tell them a fib, did you, Lester? Gibby said. Mother raised me better. Those guys are going to come here and start a riot, Les said, as though to himself. Then louder, don't you care? Never mind me, don't you care that this is going to cause all kinds of problems for Phil, lose us this job? Don't you care? Care, oh, care. Do I care? No, I can't say that I care, Gibby said. You care, Tom? Stu asked. Nah, I ain't seen a good riot in 2-3 weeks. Me, Stu said. I don't care. A leering smirk lingered on his face. That makes it unanimous. He reached for the bottle and started to bring it to his lips. Hey, he said as the bottle left his hand. Les stood over him, gripping the bottle by the neck, his fingers and knuckles completely white. Easy, Les, Stu said, shrinking back. Easy? There was rage in Les's voice and in his eyes as he stood over the much larger man. Easy? Then the expression on his face became one of intense concentration and pain as he remained motionless, continuing to grip the bottle just as tightly for a long minute. Finally he turned and walked out the door. They heard the bottle smash on the concrete steps. He came back in. Easy, Les, Stu said again, taking one visible deep breath after another. We don't need Herbie and them coming over here. Ha! Oh, that's great. That's great. You get the prize. Gibby twittered somewhat nervously. Now what's poor Tom going to do about his toothache, he muttered. He won't sleep a wink. Take it easy, Les, Stu said, calmer, studying Les as he paced between the bunks. We'll straighten it out with those guys. Straighten it out. Attaboy, pup. Attaboy. You do that. You straighten it out. He walked out. The particles that stung his face were melting against it. He went back down to the parking lot and sat on the loading platform outside the storage barn. He began to shiver. Won't be long to wait. He was relieved to see the same lone light on at Phil's. Stay down there at your boys a while longer, he said out loud. Won't be long. He wasn't wrong. He hadn't been sitting there 15 minutes when a car with a loud muffler pulled into the entrance drive and started around the storage barn towards the trailer, when its occupants, seeing him sitting there facing the parking lot, brought their car within 10 feet of him, leaving the lights on and the car running. Even in the dim light, he recognized the 2 men in the front seat as the men he had hired and then fired. He remembered their names, but he couldn't even remember who was who. Now the headlights blinded him. An enormous man emerged from the back seat, as large as Stu or Fred, though young and fit. He merely stood beside the car, grinning, leaning against the car door. It was the man from the passenger side of the front seat who approached him with quick steps, his fists preceding his confused words, grievances mingled with answers to threats Les had never made. There was no reasoning with him, and Les wasn't about to fight 3 men, not here anyway, not now. He clutched the bumper rail of the loading platform, clutched it with all his strength, and with an active will far stronger than it would have taken to fight, or at least defend himself. As the blows came, he tried to lean away from them and turn away from them, but otherwise he received the steady stream of blows, all to his face, leaning back and back from his seated position, but neither lying back nor standing up and actively resisting in any way. The incoherent, drunken words continued, the blows continued, though they began to lose their force, whether because he was being knocked out or his assailant was tiring, he couldn't know. He could still hear. He heard the huge man standing beside the car grow disgusted by his lack of response. Heard him climb back into the car and slam the door. He heard his assailant's taunts turn into something more like pleas, as weak and pathetic as his latest blows. And then he heard himself. He heard himself, who with the last effort of his animal self, which wouldn't allow himself to be knocked senseless without some kind of struggle, with one last effort of the man at his very best, who couldn't allow a struggle essentially ethical to end without his opponent knowing who was in the right, who was overwhelmingly the stronger. He heard himself who had, in the blink of an eye, grabbed his opponent by the throat with his left hand, then knelt on top of him, his right hand in a fist with all its power despite its broken bone, despite its seasons, its fatigue. This enormous, work-swollen fist held over his opponent's head, ready to crush it, as his own blood and saliva poured onto that horrified, vanquished face, heard himself say, "That's it," in a tone unmistakably final, though the voice was slurred, and saw through swollen, stinging eyes that horrified face nod just enough for him to notice. Then he let go of the throat, and opened his fist, and sat back. In another moment the car was gone, and the parking lot was just as it had been. If not for the distinct tire tracks and the trace of fine, blowing snow, and the blood streaming down his seemingly burning face, he might have convinced himself that the absurd encounter was just a particularly vivid, if incoherent, dream. He crawled over to the weeds between the building and the plastic greenhouse, and vomited his supper, then gathered enough of the clean, new snow to rub on his face, at least partially soothing it and cleaning it up. He entered the greenhouse, its heater on, its fan blowing, its smell of fungicide and packaged soil, climbed under the wooden rack with its thousands of young plants, and fell asleep on the crushed rock floor, with his head on his arm. His thirst and throbbing head woke him as it was just becoming light. It was warm in the greenhouse, though it was being battered by the wind. His smashed nose was fully clotted and plugged. The left side of his swollen face bore the indentations of the pebbles it had lately rested against. The snow was the nearest remedy for his problems, for his thirst, his headache, his swollen eyes, through which he could, at first, barely see. The snow had the texture and consistency of beach sand, blown into ridges and deep piles wherever there was an obstruction, swept nearly free from open areas. At first he thought something else was wrong with his eyes. He couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction, usually closer to 20. Soon he realized it was just the blizzard itself. There was just an inch or so on most of the parking lot. He walked away from the slight shelter of the greenhouse wall and into the storm, back towards the trailer, the van, the picker's quarters. There was a pillow on the bunk he had sat on the previous evening. It would be quieter there than in the trailer, particularly once those boys went over to the trailer to eat. They'd probably hang out there all morning. He felt a visceral repulsion as he approached the concrete block building, a repulsion that grew stronger the closer he got to it. Almost simultaneously, he realized that he didn't feel tired, and that it wasn't really very cold out. The wind was fierce enough. His face was already growing numb, and the tiny crystals stung like miniature whiplashes. One huge cloud of crystals billowed after another, rising up from the west and swirling eastward, closing down visibility to next to nothing. Instead of the storm increasing his discomfort, he felt a bit better than when he had first awoken. Might as well walk around a while. By the time he got back, he would probably be exhausted, and the picker's quarters might be empty. Might as well bring his saw. Not that he'd use it. There was no snow on the limbs at all, though the lower portions of the trunks on the western side were piled high and partially plastered. His pole and handsaw were hanging in his row. Gas and oil were up there, at least enough for a few trees. He need only hang his saw on his belt and go. He began to feel quite lighthearted. A walk in the snowstorm was just what the doctor ordered. He wouldn't work, but there was nothing particularly intimidating about this storm. He had worked through dozens of others. Rather than walk up the tractor road as usual, or fight his way through all the brush by going straight up the hill, he went first all the way to the north, until he reached the end of the orchard. There was a stone wall engulfed in brush and trees at the property boundary, and there he finally turned up the hill to the west, straight into the wind. He had guessed there would be a little shelter from the wind over there, but he was wrong. One stinging wave after another of snow particles carried by whipping wind lashed his unprotected face. He could barely catch his breath, and had to pause several times and face away from the wind to breathe easily before finally reaching the top of the small knoll. The snow was extraordinarily stiff and dense. Even where it was a foot or more deep, the indentations of his boots didn't penetrate more than a few inches, truly like beach sand or concrete starting to set up. Each boot print was clean-sided, as though a boot-shaped cookie cutter had lopped out a section. Then the blowing snow gradually filled them back in. Near the woods to the west, he was suddenly in a sea of hoof prints. All the tender buds from the thousands of felled limbs must have made for good browsing. There they were, 6, 8, 9, at least 9 deer in the relative shelter of the forest trees just at the edge of his vision. How many were beyond that? Seemingly unconcerned by his arrival, though starting to drift away, he whistled sharply, and they froze and turned to stare at him. Nothing to be afraid of. No reason to run. Stick around and keep me company. He followed that last row of orchard trees back to the south, closer to where he had left off Wednesday, now down westward into the shorter rows. 2 rows, 3. Here, this was his. A little farther to the south, he left his saw with his other tools. No, he wouldn't work. Not at the moment. Not with such a symphony of woods and winds in progress, not with such a ballet of dancing trees, such a lovely, eerie chorus of whistling and creaking, of gusting and booming voices. Farther down to the west, 5, 6, 7 rows, shorter and shorter, and then the woods again. Huge old oaks and maples, hickories and tulip poplars. Another tractor road slants gently down into the woods. He's feeling fine now. He is dandy. He is past the cold, past the aches, past even the numbness and pain in his face and head. Just to be sure, he takes a glove off and touches the warm hand to his face. Fine, not even cold. As long as he moves briskly, he'll stay warm as toast. A little farther down, he veers off the road, finds the frozen-over little pond he has seen once before. It's an oval, almost a circle, not even an acre in area. The wind has whipped all the snow to the eastern side, where it billows up in a deep, wave-like ridge. There's even a patch of bare ice in the middle. He won't go out to it, though he guesses the ice is plenty thick. He goes around the perimeter once, and around again in his own path. It's as light out as it will get, but at times he can't even see the other side for all the blowing, billowing snow. The ice seems thick. If it hasn't cracked along the edges, it surely won't crack in the middle. He ventures out, hears a crack and a boom, but not beneath his feet, in the woods. The forest trees are all around, creaking, whistling, and howling. In the center of the pond, making a circle in the little patch of clear ice, at the very center of the symphony now, more bombastic and eerie than any he has ever heard. There they are again, the deer, only 2. He whistles again, and they stand at the edge of the pond, at the edge of his vision. Where's the rest? Come on then, Plenty of room on the ice. Nothing to fear. Not today, anyway. No? Be that way. Certainly are thick down this way, and tame as bunnies. Walking off the ice, creaking, cracking, and booming all around, all of it in the trees. He leaves the ice and makes his way back to the tractor road. His old footprints have already filled in. Lord, it's blowing, but not accumulating much. He walks back up to the orchard. Much easier walking with the wind, even if it is uphill. Well, it has been fun. A fringe benefit. Every job has its fringe benefits, even if rather ordinary. Can't work? No pay, but you can enjoy the snowstorm. It wasn't much, but it wasn't bad either. It wasn't cancer. But why not work, for a little while at least? He wasn't tired. Far from it. He'd never get back to sleep. Why go back down? He could go all day and all night again if he had to. He wouldn't do that. Just do a few trees at a gentle pace. Join the trees in the ballet. Add the notes of his saw to the chorus. If he could only find the gas can. There's the little devil. He unburied it in the jug of oil. Not much left in either. He walked the length of the row and then back again. 10 trees. All big, but none enormous. Gravy. He'd have to watch his swollen face on all the suckers and all the brambly garbage underneath the trees. You'd think a guy with a dozen tractors could fit a sickle bar mower to one of them, run it under the trees once a decade or so. He was all right, though, that old man. More than all right. He started the saw, started to run it near the ground for the brambles, then shut it off. Let the pole go in there after all that junk. Out into the row, never touch it. That's more like it. Now up and in. This one goes. Bye. Up and through the center he climbed as he had done perhaps 50,000 times, and hoped to do 50 or 100,000 more. Why not? Why should an artist give it up before his time was up? The wind made the whole top of the tree sway, whipped the little branches in arcs and swirls. As he ran the saw and made his cuts, the wind pulled the sawdust out and carried it away with the particles of snow, swirling and dancing through the air, and then down along the ground where the chips and flakes of sawdust flowed and tumbled until they found his footprints, where some of them settled in and came to rest and were soon covered by more blowing snow, and the rest of the sawdust flowed and tumbled on up to the crest of the hill and down the far side. As he worked each tree, his footsteps alongside the row filled with sawdust and snow, one after the other. The world beyond each tree simply disappeared. There was only each tree as he worked it. Behind him, the tree he had just finished. Ahead of him, the next one to be done. Beyond that, there was only chaos. Whirling, white chaos. Glowing. The land and sky around him seemed to glow, and then it seemed that the tree beneath him glowed, and that he himself was glowing, and this dance he did with his feet, with his hands, with every lean sinew and muscle in his frame, and every firing synapse in his mind, was the same as the dance of the trees and snow, with the wind, and the whole earth with them, glowing and fine. That day, that morning at least, there was simply nothing else in the world, just Les and his work, his trees. Who else but he, who better than he, could do this work, which was nothing less than seeing to it that older growers remain productive and useful. Cut down their trees and old growers will decline, fade away and die. He had seen it happen, but as long as he was around, they could hang in there for one more season, one more crop. Helping these growers provide good food for people, what could be better? What could be more important than that? Midway through the 6th tree, he ran out of gas. End of gas in saw, end of gas in can. Kaput. He left the saw by the can and went back for his handsaw. He would be able to hear something besides the drone of the saw this way. would be even better. 4 trees left in the row. He would do that much, and then call it a morning. Call it a day. But what a fine one. He didn't want it to end. Without the hearing protectors on, all the creaking and wind noises through the branches came back in full force, as well as a new little tinkly, crackly noise. Vision was improving, almost double what it had been. The wind was as fierce, but it carried less snow. It wasn't just what it did for the growers that was good about his work. It was just plain worthwhile. Good work. Craft, a genuine craft. Each tree a distinct creative project. At first a dense mass, but ultimately, after his eye had gathered it in, and his mind had studied it and determined what to do, and his hand had executed that action, a thing of beauty, the beauty of usefulness, to create, to shape something good, something beautiful with one's own hands, was nothing less than to participate in the act of creation. It wasn't everybody who got to help God do his work. Oh, but it was, if they were only aware of it. But his most important work was so far away. Those 2 precious miracles he had helped create 10 and 12 years ago, and had so lovingly tended ever since. His heart ached for them, called out to them. For he was something more important than the leader of a country or the head of a company. He was a father, and for his boys, what wouldn't he do? What humiliations wouldn't he face and shrug off? For his boys, who were his whole life, he would endure anything, suffer anything. Stand on my shoulders, boys. Stand and look out as far as your eyes can see. Leap as high as your legs will allow. Fly if you will. But for now, stand on me, boys, for as long as I live. It was impossible that he was gone from their lives and they from his. It was unthinkable. What hoops might he be made to jump through to regain his place in his own family? It didn't matter. He would jump through them. To be the father of his boys, he would accept any punishment, with the exception of irrelevance. Give up this work and take other? All right. Whatever work he had to take, he would do it well. Perhaps that was all it would take. Be at home all the time, working regular hours somewhere. He could accept that for his boys. Put on a monkey suit. Sell cosmetics door to door. Whatever it took. But here it was Thursday. The boy's vacation was nearly up. Hadn't he done his part here? Hadn't he done his best? Herbie would have to understand. Or not. But he was done anyway. Done for this week. Done for this orchard. Done with this crew. He would finish out the season with his own jobs, but now he was going to spend a few days with his boys, come hell or high water. He would come to understand what was expected of him. He was equal to it, whatever it was. There was just this row to finish, just these last couple of trees. Then he would get home somehow, walk if need be. Just these couple of trees, but it was growing increasingly slick, almost imperceptibly, by tiny degrees, as the wind shifted around to the south, and the snow changed to rain, which, for the moment, was freezing and sticking to everything. On any ordinary day, he would simply have hung his saw on his belt, climbed down, and waited until the ice was gone. But this wasn't an ordinary day. This was his last day, and he didn't want to leave the row unfinished. It was the first day of whatever life was to emerge. Not so different from his current one, perhaps. He wasn't going to become a new person. He knew one thing. Nothing, no one would ever separate him from his family, from his sons again. His sons, who he would be seeing very soon. This evening. He couldn't leave just yet, though. He couldn't leave this row unfinished. There was nothing rational about this last determination. It was only one more tree. Someone else could do it as easily as he. In hindsight, had he had the opportunity for hindsight, he would have simply left it unfinished and proceeded with his course of action. Finishing that row was somehow wrapped up in his mind with his whole outlook for the future, as though for some reason the latter couldn't proceed without the former. Even when he slipped while climbing and badly jammed his left wrist, he merely shook it out and went at it again. Maybe if he'd been down in the dumps, that would have been enough to stop him. He climbed the icy trunk and limbs, slithered out a limb at the very top of the tree, caught the handsaw in a little 3-inch branch that the chainsaw would have blown through in a split second. He lost his footing as he used both hands to free the saw, and with neither hand in a position to hold on, and nothing much to hold on to, he fell. In the few moments of dreamlike consciousness left to him, his final allotment of time on earth, he was no longer in the storm, no longer in the snow and ice, no longer in pain. It was summertime, and a warm, gentle breeze was blowing. There was the smell of trees and new leaf just outside the window, the gentle fragrance of flowers, and the comfort of a well-worn easy chair, on the arm of which he rested, and he was enveloped by the presence of a gentle, wise being, all loving, all love, to whom he gave himself completely, and was no longer troubled about anything. Chapter 4. A Triumphant Life. Pete DeWitt sometimes talked about Les in those impromptu gatherings of working men he seemed custom-made for addressing. It was a freak kind of a thing. Well, that's how guys get killed on the job. Full bin of apples falls on top of somebody. Rung of a ladder snaps. Oh, you can take your precautions, but you can't stop every accident from happening. Sure, it was bad weather, but we all worked in worse. He sure had. And you never seen anybody surer in a tree. I seen lots of spills. Dozens. Hundreds. But I never did see Les take a spill. And boys that know say he just didn't. Just didn't take spills. And you can bet that a guy like him knew just how to fall in case he did. You kind of roll to your side and put your arm under your head, cushion the blow. So first off, you got a guy that don't take spills, and he takes one. Bad one. Right from the top. And then it's one of them spills where you spin out so that you can't control a thing about the way you fall. Then a big fat old bottom limb has to be right where the back of his head wants to go. Well, mister, that's all she took. You can take a spill from 30 feet or more and not get a scratch. I seen it happen. And you can fall a few feet and break your neck. Then, of course, there weren't nobody up there at the time. He'd at least have survived if somebody was around. Crewmen never even knew he was working. Figured he split. It was over 2 hours later before the guy who worked down in the sales barn went up there, kinda on a whim. Said he thought he heard a chainsaw when he finished plowing the parking lot. Only thought of it later, how he hadn't heard the saw in a long time. Just kind of a hunch. By then didn't make no difference anyway. Les was just kind of draped over a bottom limb, like a U or maybe a V, stiff as a board. Come down off the hill looking that way. Crewmen brung him down. Just a bad break. A freak kind of thing. But you wanted to see that boy when he was alive. Working a tree, that's when he was alive. Just a joy to watch, just a pure joy. Like he didn't have no bones. Like he was right there with every tree he did. Right a part of it. Can't hardly describe it. By this point, the group he was addressing would be shuffling their feet a little, looking for a way to change the subject. More than a decade has passed. Les's wife, Claire, hasn't remarried, though she eventually got a home of her own. His boys have done all right. His older son is in graduate school for archaeology. The younger works construction and writes computer software. He's been looking into the seals. A lovely girl has fallen head over heels for him. In a few more years, the boys will be approaching the age at which their father died. The crew actually finished the block that Friday morning before heading for home. Rather than the horrible event making it impossible to concentrate, impossible to work, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Even the more immature of them worked more determinedly, more solemnly, much more like Les always worked. Even the joyful note that was always part of his work crept into their own. It turned out to be a glorious day, as the weatherman had predicted. By the time day broke on Friday, not only had the freezing rain ceased, but the dreariness and dripping was all done as well. From the start, the sun was bright, and it warmed up quickly. The finest day they had seen in quite some time. By the time they finished work in the early afternoon, some of them were down to t-shirts. The snow, where it hadn't drifted into deep piles, rapidly yielded to soggy ground. Someone took Les's chainsaw, started it, and drove it straight into the partially thawed ground below Les's last tree, and left it there, which some thought a fitting gesture, and others considered a waste of a perfectly good machine. It remained there for a few years, until Phil died and his son had the whole block bulldozed. On a walk in the orchard later that Friday afternoon, two of Phil's grandkids, a boy and a girl, noticed the footprints made of sawdust which had been left in the soggy grass beside Les's last row. They played a kind of impromptu hopscotch on and around them. The little girl put her palm down over one of them. Then they continued on their way. The footprints remained only until the sun dried the ground, and a warm, gentle breeze dispersed the sawdust.